My name is Gemma, and I am 33 years old. You are grounded until you sign a full confession and apologize to your brother, my father roared in front of 45 relatives. They all laughed, treating a grown woman like a disobedient toddler. My face burned, but I simply picked up my bag and said, "All right." By the next morning, my father sneered, thinking I had finally learned my place. But then he noticed my empty room, and the family lawyer stormed into the house trembling and shouting, asking my father what on earth he had just done. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family that thought you were nothing. The air inside the grand ballroom of the Montgomery estate was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and roasted meats. It was the 35th anniversary of Montgomery Holdings, the financial empire my father Richard had built from the ground up. 45 of our relatives were gathered under the glittering crystal chandeliers, their glasses clinking, their laughter echoing off the marble floors. I stood near the edge of the room, sipping sparkling water and watching the spectacle. As a financial forensics expert, I was trained to observe, to look for the hidden truths beneath shiny surfaces. But tonight I was just playing the role of the quiet, unremarkable daughter. The string quartet was playing a lively symphony when my father suddenly marched to the center of the room. He did not tap his glass politely. He grabbed a heavy leather-bound audit folder from a nearby table and slammed it down onto the main dining table with such force that a crystal wine glass shattered. The dark red liquid spilled across the white linen like a fresh wound. The music stopped abruptly. The chatter died down. 45 pairs of eyes turned toward the patriarch of the family. Richard Montgomery glared across the room, his face flushed with a rage that seemed too theatrical to be entirely genuine. His arm shot out, his index finger pointing directly at my face. He accused me loudly and clearly of abusing my system access at the firm. He claimed I had orchestrated a massive embezzlement scheme, making $12 million disappear from the VIP investor fund. The number hung in the silent room, heavy and suffocating. $12 million. Before I could even process the absurdity of the accusation, my older brother Cameron stood up from his seat. Cameron was 36 years old, the vice president of the firm and the undisputed golden child of the Montgomery family. He wore a custom-tailored suit and an expression of deep manufactured sorrow. He stepped forward, playing the role of the heartbroken brother to absolute perfection. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a stack of printed emails. He held them up for the crowd to see, his voice trembling with fake emotion as he claimed these were digital authorizations bearing my encrypted signature, proving I had funneled the money into offshore accounts. I stared at the papers in his hand. I knew exactly what they were because I knew exactly what Cameron had been doing for the past 6 months. But as I opened my mouth to defend myself, to point out the glaring technical impossibilities of his claim, a sharp stinging pain exploded across my left cheek. My mother Beatrice had crossed the distance between us faster than I could react. The force of her slap turned my head violently to the side. My ear rang and the metallic taste of blood bloomed on my inner lip. I slowly turned my face back to look at her. Beatrice was weeping hysterically, her diamond earrings shaking as she performed her grief for the audience of relatives. She screamed at me, her voice shrill and piercing. She demanded to know how I could betray my own blood. She wailed about how she had begged my father not to give me a position at the firm. She told the entire room that I had always been consumed by jealousy because Cameron was the rightful heir to the Montgomery empire. She accused me of stealing the family wealth just to fund some secret degenerate lifestyle, punishing them for loving my brother more. The 45 relatives did not need any more convincing. They were parasites entirely dependent on the dividends and trust funds managed by Montgomery Holdings. Their loyalty belonged to the money, and by extension to Richard and Cameron. A low, venomous murmur swept through the ballroom, quickly escalating into open hostility. Aunt Patricia, gripping her pearl necklace loudly, declared that I was a stain on the Montgomery legacy. Uncle Greg scoffed, calling me an ungrateful wretch who had finally shown my true colors. Cousins I had helped tutor in college now looked at me with open disgust, whispering insults that were meant to be heard. They called me a thief, a failure, a jealous spinster who could not stand to see her brother shine. The narrative was perfectly constructed. I was the bitter shadow, and Cameron was the shining star I had tried to extinguish. I stood completely still, my cheek burning from the slap, surrounded by a chorus of hatred. This was the family dynamic I had endured my entire life. Cameron could do no wrong, and I was the designated scapegoat for every failure, every misstep, every missing dollar. They were building a wall of noise, a unified front designed to overwhelm me, to break my spirit so I would crumble and accept the blame. I heard several voices demanding that my father call the police immediately. They wanted to see me led out of the mansion in handcuffs, a public execution to satisfy their outrage. But my father held up both hands, silencing the mob. Richard Montgomery did not want the police. The police would ask questions. The police would conduct their own audits. Richard wanted absolute control. He wanted to play the merciful but strict patriarch who handled family business internally. He looked at me with utter contempt, his chest heaving as he delivered his verdict. He screamed that I was grounded. The word echoed off the high ceilings. Grounded. I was a 33-year-old woman, an independent professional, and my father was publicly sentencing me to a childhood punishment. He ordered me to march up the grand staircase to my old bedroom on the second floor. He declared that he was freezing every credit card with my name on it, cutting off my access to the outside world. I was forbidden from stepping foot outside that room until I wrote a full legally binding confession and a formal apology to Cameron. He intended to present my written confession to the board of directors the very next morning, neatly wrapping up the missing $12 million with a bow of my own humiliation. The ballroom erupted into cruel, mocking laughter. The relatives found it absolutely hilarious. The image of a grown woman being sent to her room like a naughty child delighted them. They pointed and sneered, enjoying the spectacle of my complete degradation. I looked through the sea of laughing faces and locked eyes with Cameron. He was not laughing. He was watching me with a sly, victorious smirk. He genuinely believed his plan had worked flawlessly. He believed he had successfully framed his quiet, unassuming sister for his massive financial crimes, securing his inheritance and saving his own skin. He expected me to cry. My mother expected me to beg for forgiveness. My father expected me to shatter under the weight of his authority. But I felt no sadness. I felt no fear. The stinging in my cheek was nothing compared to the cold, absolute clarity sharpening in my mind. I looked at the people who shared my blood, recognizing that there was nothing left to salvage here. They had handed me the exact opportunity I needed. I slowly reached down and picked up my designer handbag from the floor. I adjusted the strap on my shoulder. I looked directly at my father, then at my mother, and finally at my brother. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I simply said, "All right." I turned my back on the 45 laughing relatives and walked toward the grand staircase. My footsteps were steady and measured against the marble floor. I could hear their mocking comments trailing behind me, celebrating their supposed victory. I climbed the stairs without looking back, walking into the trap they thought they had set for me. They believed they were locking me away to face my ruin. They had no idea that by sending me to that room, they had just given me the perfect alibi for the storm I was about to unleash upon them all. The heavy oak door of my childhood bedroom slammed shut behind me. The unmistakable click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed in the quiet hallway. My father had actually locked me in. I stood in the center of the room, listening to the muffled sounds filtering up through the floorboards. The string quartet had resumed playing their lively symphony. I could hear the faint, distinct chime of crystal glasses clinking together. Downstairs, my brother Cameron was undoubtedly receiving pats on the back and words of sympathy from our relatives. They were celebrating his brilliant maneuver, raising toast to the golden boy who had supposedly saved the family empire from his malicious, jealous sister. The room itself was exactly as I had left it years ago. Pale pink walls, a canopy bed, a white vanity mirror. It was a monument to the compliant, quiet daughter they had always wanted me to be. I walked over to the adjoining bathroom, turned on the cold water, and splashed my face. The stinging on my left cheek from my mother's slap was already fading into a dull ache. I grabbed a towel, dried my skin, and looked at my reflection. There were no tears in my eyes. There was no panic in my chest. The terrified girl who used to cry in this room was long gone. The woman staring back at the mirror had a job to do. I walked back into the bedroom and approached the small, unassuming leather weekender bag I had brought with me. To the naked eye, it looked like standard designer luggage, perfectly suited for a weekend visit to the family estate. I laid it flat on the mattress and unzipped the main compartment. I tossed aside the carefully folded blouses and makeup bags. I ran my fingers along the bottom seam of the suitcase until I felt the hidden mechanical latch. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner concealed beneath the fabric. A soft click signaled the release of the false bottom. I pulled out a heavy, matte black laptop. It was not the standard-issue corporate machine my father had assigned to me when I supposedly joined his firm as a low-level data analyst. This was a custom-built military-grade device encased in shockproof titanium alloy and equipped with multiple layers of hardware encryption. I set it on the vanity desk, plugging the power adapter into the wall. I flipped open the screen and placed my finger on the scanner. The machine booted up instantly, bypassing standard operating systems and diving straight into a secure encrypted Linux environment. My father and brother thought I was a fool. They genuinely believed that my 6 months working at Montgomery Holdings were spent pushing papers, organizing files, and desperately seeking their validation. They thought they had handed me a pity job to keep me quiet. They were wrong. I was not a simple data clerk. I was a highly specialized financial forensics expert. My entire career was built on tracking dirty money, untangling complex webs of shell companies, and bringing down white-collar criminals who thought their wealth made them untouchable. 6 months ago, I was approached by David Caldwell, a senior agent at the Securities and Exchange Commission. The federal government had been quietly watching Montgomery Holdings for years. They knew massive amounts of capital were bleeding out of the firm into unregulated offshore accounts. But Richard and Cameron had buried the paper trail under impenetrable layers of corporate obfuscation. The SEC could not legally secure a warrant without hard, irrefutable evidence from the inside. They needed a ghost in the machine. They needed someone the Montgomery men would never suspect, someone they viewed with such profound arrogance and contempt that they would never bother to monitor her digital footprint. They needed me. David Caldwell had sat across from me in a secure briefing room and laid out the mission. He warned me about the psychological toll of returning to the family that had treated me so poorly. But I did not hesitate. I accepted the assignment not out of a desire for petty revenge, but because I knew exactly what kind of predators my father and brother were. I typed a string of complex commands into the terminal, watching lines of green code cascade down the black screen. Cameron's arrogance was his greatest weakness. He thought he was a criminal mastermind because he knew how to forge a digital signature and route funds through a proxy. He thought pinning the theft of $12 million on me would solve his immediate liquidity problems. He assumed I would panic cry and eventually break under the pressure of my father's wrath and the family's collective shaming. He expected me to sit in this locked room and write a false confession just to win back their affection and avoid prison. He did not realize that I had mapped every single inch of the Montgomery Holdings private server network over the past 24 weeks. I knew the architecture of their data centers better than their own lead developers. I plugged a specialized decryption drive into the side of the laptop. This was the moment I had been preparing for all along. By confining me to the family estate, my father had unwittingly placed me inside the perimeter of their secure home network, granting me direct, unmonitored access to the local servers Cameron used for his private, off-the-books transactions. I initiated the bypass protocol. My fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced precision. The challenge was not just breaking into Cameron's personal server. The challenge was doing it silently, slicing through his security measures without triggering any automated alarms that might alert him downstairs. I watched the progress bar on my screen slowly fill. Downstairs, the party roared on. I could almost picture my mother Beatrice holding court, accepting sympathy from the aunts and uncles for having such a dreadful daughter. I could picture my father puffing his chest, proud of his swift, decisive discipline. The progress bar hit 50%. I ran a secondary script to mask my IP address, bouncing my connection through 3 different encrypted proxy servers before linking back to the estate's main router. If Cameron somehow managed to check his logs right now, all he would see was standard automated maintenance traffic. The bar crept up to 75%. The muffled sound of applause drifted up from the ballroom. My brother was likely giving a speech reassuring the VIP investors in the room that their money was safe, playing the absolute hero, while the real thief stood at the podium. 90%. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes locked on the flashing cursor. The air in the room felt perfectly still. I held my breath as the decryption algorithm hammered against the final wall of Cameron's administrative defenses. He had used a standard enterprise-level firewall, arrogant enough to believe that basic commercial security could keep his secrets buried forever. He underestimated the tools the federal government had placed at my disposal. A soft, high-pitched ping emitted from the laptop speakers. The scrolling lines of code abruptly stopped. The black terminal window cleared itself. In the center of the screen, a single line of bright green text appeared. Cameron's server firewall breached. Cameron's server firewall breached. I hit the enter key, pulling up the raw directory tree of his hidden drive. The digital landscape of my brother's deception unfolded before me in stark white text against a black background. He had constructed a mirrored environment, a digital labyrinth designed to fool any standard corporate audit. The surface level perfectly matched the company ledgers showcasing my IP address, allegedly authorizing the unauthorized transfer of $12 million. It was a neat, tidy narrative, perfectly packaged for my father to present to the board. But digging into the root access revealed the ghost ledger, the actual unfiltered record of where the money had gone. Suddenly, a red warning prompt flashed in the bottom right corner of my terminal. Automated purge sequence initiated. My heart hammered against my ribs. Cameron was arrogant, but he was not completely stupid. He had installed a dead man's switch, a destructive scrubbing script tied directly to the firewall's integrity. The moment my decryption tools forced their way in, the server registered the intrusion and began shredding the original data. He wanted to ensure that once the fake evidence was presented downstairs, the real logs would be overwritten with randomized, unrecoverable junk data. I glanced at the digital clock on my screen. The script was executing rapidly, tearing through the outer directories. I had exactly 60 minutes, perhaps less, before every piece of incriminating evidence tying Cameron to the embezzlement evaporated into the digital ether. I launched a multi-thread cloning protocol, pushing my military-grade laptop to its absolute processing limits. The cooling fans whirred to life, a quiet, steady hum that masked the intense cyber battle happening on the screen. Lines of hexadecimal data poured into my secure encrypted partition. I watched the purge script creeping through the sectors like a digital wildfire, eating away at the transaction histories. I had to prioritize. I bypassed the standard communications folders and aimed my extraction tools directly at the offshore routing logs. It was a desperate race between my cloning software and his shredding algorithm. As the files frantically transferred, my decryption tools automatically sorted the ledgers in real time. The narrative Cameron had spun downstairs to our 45 relatives was a masterpiece of fiction. The reality displayed on my monitor was a pathetic tragedy of greed and incompetence. The $12 million had not been quietly embezzled into a hidden retirement account. The money had not been stolen to fund a secret, lavish lifestyle. I isolated the metadata and followed the digital breadcrumbs. Cameron had aggressively funneled the capital through 3 different shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. He used layered corporate identities to wash the funds, making them appear as legitimate overseas investments. From there, the money flowed directly into dark web cryptocurrency exchanges. My brother had been gambling. He was not just playing high-stakes poker in velvet-lined back rooms. He was leveraging corporate funds on unregulated, highly volatile crypto betting syndicates. I pulled up the transaction timestamps and cross-referenced them with market data. Cameron had been shorting obscure tokens, betting against the market with astonishingly bad judgment. When his initial bets failed, he panicked. He desperately tried to cover his previous losses by doubling down with our investors' money. He chased the deficit, making increasingly reckless wagers until the entire $12 million evaporated. He had lost every single cent. He had absolutely nothing left to show for it. The next batch of files confirmed the exact mechanics of his setup. I found the keystroke logs and the specific spoofing software he had purchased to clone my encrypted digital signature. The timeline was damning. He had accessed my secure terminal 2 weeks ago on a Tuesday afternoon. That was the exact day my mother Beatrice had insisted I accompany her to a mandatory all-day human resources seminar regarding family conduct in the workplace. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The entire family had been playing their parts. My mother had orchestrated my absence, creating the perfect window of opportunity so the golden boy could sit at my desk and execute his frame job. The slap across my face downstairs was just the finale of a performance they had been rehearsing for weeks. The purge script reached the final directory just as my cloning protocol snatched the last crucial packet of spoofing logs. The percentage bar hit 100. A split second later, the screen blinked, and the original directory vanished entirely, wiped clean by Cameron's failsafe. The connection terminated. Let him think his tracks were permanently covered. Let him celebrate downstairs, secure in the delusion that he had won. The pristine, uncorrupted data, the absolute proof of his financial crimes, was now safely locked inside my federal-grade partition. The digital conflict was over. I had won. Now it was time to deploy the weapon. I opened my encrypted direct communication channel to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Special Agent David Caldwell would be monitoring the secure federal relay, waiting for my signal. I compiled the massive data packet, organizing the Cayman routing numbers, the cryptocurrency wallet IDs, the spoofing software logs, and the undeniable proof of Cameron's devastating gambling losses. I typed a brief clinical message to accompany the files. The internal audit is complete. The $12 million is gone, burned entirely on offshore crypto betting exchanges. Cameron Montgomery is the sole actor. I have secured the spoofing evidence proving he framed me. Initiate the global asset freeze immediately. I hit send. A green checkmark appeared on the screen, confirming the federal relay had received the payload. The trap was set. David Caldwell would spend the rest of the night securing the federal warrants. By morning, the full weight of the United States government would crash down on Montgomery Holdings. But the federal prosecution was only one part of the execution. I needed the Montgomery empire to implode from the inside out. I needed the architects of my lifelong misery to turn on each other before the authorities even knocked on the door. I opened a new, untraceable email client, routing the connection through a VPN to ensure it could never be blocked by the estate's network administrators. I addressed the message to Harrison Gable. Harrison was the fiercely loyal, ruthlessly pragmatic chief legal counsel for our family firm. He was a man who protected the company above all else, prioritizing the firm's survival over any individual family member, even my father. If anyone would understand the catastrophic danger of Cameron's actions, it was Harrison. I attached a single, highly compressed PDF file to the email. It contained a devastatingly clear summary of the Cayman Island transfers, the crypto losses, and the irrefutable proof of the forged audit. It was just enough information to prove that the company was standing on a landmine and that the CEO's son held the detonator. I left the body of the email completely blank. The documents spoke for themselves. I moved my cursor to the scheduling tool. I set a delayed delivery timer. Harrison Gable would receive this email at exactly 6:30 tomorrow morning. That was precisely 30 minutes before my father planned to march into the boardroom and proudly present my forced confession to the directors. I smiled, the cold blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. I closed the laptop, locked it back inside the false bottom of my weekender bag, and stood up from the vanity desk. The cyber phase of my revenge was perfectly executed. Now it was time to make my physical exit. The digital clock on the bedside table flipped to 3 in the morning. The sprawling Montgomery mansion had finally fallen into a heavy, intoxicated silence. The string quartet had packed up hours ago. The 45 relatives had retreated to their respective guest wings or driven back to their own homes, undoubtedly dreaming of the dividends my father had promised them. Down the hall, I could almost hear the synchronized breathing of a family completely unaware that their financial foundation had just been vaporized. I moved away from the vanity desk and approached my weekender bag once more. From the secondary compartment, I extracted a compact battery-operated thermal printer. I connected it to the laptop with a short encrypted cable. I did not need to leave a long emotional letter. I did not need to explain my feelings or beg for their understanding. Criminals do not respond to emotion. They only respond to evidence. I selected the single most damaging document from the massive data haul I had just cloned. It was the master ledger statement from the Cayman Islands proxy account, explicitly bearing Cameron's secure routing identifier. The bottom line displayed the final balance after his disastrous crypto gambling spree. $0, 0 cents. $12 million completely eradicated. The small printer hummed quietly, spitting out the crisp white page. I took the document and walked over to the center of the room. The canopy bed with its ruffled pink duvet and excessive decorative pillows looked like a relic from a life that never really belonged to me. I placed the printed statement precisely in the middle of the mattress. It sat there, a stark, undeniable testament to my brother's guilt. I smoothed down the edges of the paper, making sure the offshore routing numbers and the zero balance were perfectly illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the window. When my father and brother inevitably stormed into this room tomorrow to demand my forced confession, this single sheet of paper would be the only thing waiting to greet them. It was a silent, lethal strike directed right at their arrogance. I did not even glance at the heavy oak door. I had no intention of picking the lock or breaking the hinges. Leaving the deadbolt exactly as my father had said it was crucial to the psychological warfare of tomorrow morning. I wanted him to believe his authority was absolute right up until the second his world collapsed. I packed the laptop and the printer back into the false bottom of the weekender bag, zipped it shut, and hoisted it onto my shoulder. I crossed the room and silently slid open the glass balcony doors. The crisp, biting night air rushed in, sweeping away the stale scent of my childhood prison. I stepped out onto the stone terrace and peered over the ornate iron railing. The drop to the manicured lawn below was steep, but this was a route I had memorized years ago when I first realized this house was a cage. Thick, mature ivy clung to the stone facade of the mansion, woven tightly through a sturdy wooden trellis that anchored into the ground floor patio. I hoisted myself over the railing with practiced efficiency. There was no hesitation, no fear of falling. I gripped the thick vines and the wooden lattice, finding my footholds in the dark. I descended swiftly and silently, my movements fluid and athletic. The physical exertion felt incredible after hours of sitting rigid in front of a glowing screen. Within seconds, my boots touched the soft, damp grass of the backyard. I crouched low, blending into the deep shadows cast by the towering oak trees that lined the perimeter of the estate. I moved through the darkness with absolute precision. I avoided the motion sensor floodlights near the pool house and bypassed the gravel pathways that would crunch under my boots. I navigated toward the rear service gate, a secondary exit primarily used by the landscaping crews. The security guard stationed at the main entrance at the front of the estate was notoriously lazy on the night shift, completely oblivious to anything outside his immediate line of sight. I slipped through the wrought iron service gate, pulling it shut with a soft metallic click that dissolved instantly into the ambient noise of the night. A sleek black luxury SUV was idling quietly on the shoulder of the private road, exactly where I had requested it. The headlights were dimmed, the engine producing nothing more than a low, powerful purr. I approached the vehicle and the driver immediately stepped out to open the rear door for me. He was a professional, asking no questions about why a woman was slipping out the back gate of a billionaire's estate at 3 in the morning. I slid into the expansive leather interior, the warmth of the cabin enveloping me immediately. "Take me to the downtown location," I instructed quietly. The driver nodded, closed the door securely, and guided the heavy vehicle away from the curb. I sank back into the plush leather seat and watched the imposing iron gates of the Montgomery estate fade away in the rearview mirror. The contrast between the toxic, suffocating environment I had just escaped and the cold, quiet luxury of this hired car was striking. I felt an overwhelming sense of liberation washing over me. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was the architect of their ruin. The city streets were completely deserted at this hour. The streetlights flashed rhythmically across the tinted windows of the SUV as we sped toward the financial district. I leaned my head against the cool glass, calculating the timeline of the impending morning. Special Agent David Caldwell was currently mobilizing the federal response team. Harrison Gable was asleep, entirely unaware of the delayed email sitting in the digital queue ready to detonate his career. My father was resting comfortably, dreaming of the $12 million he thought he had successfully recovered by sacrificing his daughter. The board was set. The pieces were moving exactly as I commanded. The SUV glided to a smooth halt in front of the soaring glass facade of the city's most exclusive luxury hotel. A night porter immediately approached, opening my door and offering to take my bag. I declined with a polite nod, preferring to keep the encrypted laptop close to me. I walked through the sliding glass doors into the cavernous, softly lit lobby. The concierge was expecting me. I had booked the reservation under an untraceable corporate alias earlier that week, utilizing funds that my father could never track or freeze. I bypassed the standard check-in process entirely. The concierge handed me a heavy, gold-trimmed keycard and directed me toward the private VIP elevators. I rode up to the highest floor of the tower. The doors opened directly into the private foyer of the presidential suite. I stepped inside, letting the heavy door seal shut behind me. The suite was a masterpiece of modern design, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the glittering downtown skyline. The city stretched out below me, a vast network of power and capital. I walked over to the sleek marble wet bar and poured myself a glass of chilled, sparkling water. I stood by the massive windows, gazing out at the financial district where Montgomery Holdings had its corporate headquarters. By noon tomorrow, that building would be swarming with federal agents. I set the glass down and pulled my personal smartphone from my pocket. I needed to execute the final psychological strike. My father loved control. He thrived on the belief that his authority was absolute and unquestionable. I opened my messaging app and navigated to my father's private number. He had proudly confiscated all my corporate devices and frozen my accounts, but he had ignored this personal unregistered phone. I typed out a single calculated sentence. I made sure the tone was perfectly submissive, echoing the defeated, compliant daughter he expected to find broken in that locked bedroom upstairs. I did not hit send immediately. I utilized the scheduling feature, setting the message to deliver to his phone at exactly 6 in the morning, right when he normally woke up to check the markets. I stared at the screen, reading the words one last time before locking the schedule in place. The message was locked and loaded. I placed the phone face down on the cool marble counter. Tomorrow morning, Richard Montgomery would wake up, reach for his phone, and read the final lie I would ever tell him. I have learned my lesson in my room. The sun rose over the manicured grounds of the Montgomery estate, casting long, arrogant shadows across the sweeping lawns. At exactly 6 in the morning, the sharp chime of an incoming message echoed in the master suite. Richard Montgomery reached blindly toward his mahogany nightstand, his fingers finding the cool metal of his smartphone. He pulled the device close, squinting through sleep-heavy eyes. There, glowing brightly on the screen, was the message I had carefully scheduled hours ago. He read the words once, then twice, and a slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across his face. He tossed the phone back onto the nightstand and stretched his arms, feeling the immense weight of the previous night completely lift from his broad shoulders. To him, the text was the ultimate surrender. It was the white flag waving from the second floor. His stubborn, troublesome daughter had finally cracked under the pressure of his absolute authority. He genuinely believed that the crushing humiliation in the ballroom had worked its magic, breaking my spirit and forcing me to accept the blame for a crime I did not commit. He rose from his king-sized bed, entirely oblivious to the fact that the message was not a surrender, but the first toll of a bell signaling his imminent destruction. By 7 in the morning, the atmosphere in the formal dining room was thick with the scent of freshly brewed imported coffee and roasted bacon. Richard sat at the head of the massive dining table, the morning newspaper neatly folded beside his porcelain cup. He looked the exact part of the triumphant king who had just crushed a minor rebellion within his kingdom. Cameron strolled into the dining room a few minutes later. He looked remarkably fresh for a man who had spent the previous evening framing his sister for a $12 million embezzlement. He wore a crisp, custom-fitted polo shirt and expensive slacks, looking every bit the pristine heir to the financial empire. He poured himself a cup of coffee and took the seat to Richard's immediate right, his face glowing with an untouchable, nauseating arrogance. "Good morning, Dad," Cameron said, taking a loud, appreciative sip from his cup. "I assume our little problem upstairs is currently drafting her resignation and full confession." Richard chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound of absolute contentment. He picked up his coffee cup and nodded confidently. "She sent me a message right at 6. Very compliant, very defeated. I told you that putting her in front of the entire family would do the trick. She just needed to be reminded of who actually holds the power in this house. She will have the written confession ready by the time we leave for the office." Cameron leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs casually. His mind was already moving past the theft, racing toward how he could manipulate my forced confession for his own financial gain. "This actually works out perfectly for us," Cameron stated, his eyes gleaming with greedy calculation. "I was thinking about the board meeting today. When we present her signed confession, detailing how she bypassed the security protocols, we do not just use it to explain the missing $12 million. We use it to demonstrate how swiftly and decisively leadership handled a rogue actor." Richard lowered his cup, clearly interested by the angle. "Go on." "We spin it into a positive narrative for the upcoming Series C funding round." Cameron explained, his hands gesturing excitedly as he laid out his fraudulent strategy. "We tell the investors that the vulnerability has been completely neutralized. I will show the board exactly how she manipulated the encryption keys. I even drafted a fake timeline of her activities to match the confession she is writing right now. It is bulletproof. The investors will eat it up. We assure them that our internal audit systems are so robust that even family members are immediately caught and prosecuted when they step out of line. It shows zero tolerance. It shows integrity. We can actually leverage her crime to ask for an additional $50 million in capital by next quarter. We might even get a feature in the financial press about our stellar crisis management." The sheer audacity of my brother was staggering. He had burned $12 million of investor funds on underground cryptocurrency betting, framed me for the loss, and was now actively plotting to use my manufactured guilt to solicit tens of millions more from unsuspecting venture capitalists. He viewed my destruction not as a necessary evil, but as a highly profitable stepping stone. "That is brilliant, Cameron." Richard praised, his voice swelling with pride. "That is exactly the kind of aggressive, forward-thinking strategy this firm needs. You took a crisis and turned it into an opportunity. This is why you are sitting in the vice president chair." The heavy dining room doors swung open, and my mother Beatrice entered the room. She was already fully dressed for the day, in a sharp designer suit, her hair perfectly coiffed, looking completely unbothered by the fact that she had viciously slapped her own daughter the night before. If anything, she looked energized, feeding off the toxic, self-congratulatory energy radiating from her husband and son. "Good morning, my two brilliant men," Beatrice chirped, gliding over to kiss Cameron on the cheek before taking her seat. "I overheard you talking about the funding round. It sounds like everything is working out exactly as it should. I always knew bringing her into the firm was a mistake, but at least her exit is providing some tangible benefit to your career, Cameron." "She is writing the confession right now," Richard informed his wife, handing her a silver plate of pastries. "We will be taking it straight to the boardroom." Beatrice smiled, a cold, predatory expression that lacked any trace of maternal warmth. She was absolutely delighted by my supposed downfall. To her, I had always been an irritating complication, a glaring imperfection in her otherwise flawless family portrait. My subjugation validated her lifelong preference for Cameron. "I spent an hour on the phone last night talking to your Aunt Carol and Uncle Greg," Beatrice boasted, setting down her silver butter knife. "They completely agree with how we handled this. Everyone in the family knows she has always harbored a deep toxic resentment toward you, Cameron. Locking her in that room was the only way to get through to her. She has to hit rock bottom before she learns respect." "I want to see it," Beatrice continued, her voice dripping with venomous anticipation. "I want to see her face when she hands that piece of paper over. I expect her to be a sobbing mess when she walks through those doors. She needs to understand that without this family, she is absolutely nothing. She would be homeless on the street if we had not shown her mercy. I want her to look me in the eye and apologize to her brother on her knees if she has to." Beatrice turned her attention to the corner of the room where the head butler, a quiet older man named Thomas, stood waiting for instructions. "Thomas," Beatrice commanded sharply, "go upstairs to the second floor. Unlock the door to the guest suite. Tell the girl that her father and brother are waiting for her written statement, and make sure you tell her to come down here immediately." Thomas gave a stiff, formal bow. "Right away, madam." He turned and exited the dining room, his footsteps echoing faintly as he made his way toward the grand staircase. Back in the dining room, the atmosphere was a picture of arrogant tranquility. Richard returned to reading the financial section of his newspaper. Cameron picked up his smartphone, likely checking the pre-market trading values, completely unaware that his offshore crypto wallets were currently frozen by federal authorities. Beatrice elegantly buttered a croissant, her face glowing with the satisfaction of a woman who believed she had successfully crushed her only daughter's spirit. They sat there bathing in their manufactured victory, convinced that their wealth and status made them invincible. They had constructed a perfect reality where their lies were absolute truth, and anyone who opposed them was simply ground into dust. The quiet elegance of the breakfast was abruptly shattered. The sound of rapid, heavy footsteps pounded down the grand marble staircase. It was a frantic, chaotic noise that completely violated the strict decorum of the Montgomery household. The heavy mahogany dining room doors were not just opened, they were pushed with such violent force that they slammed against the interior walls. Thomas, the normally composed and unflappable butler, who had served the family for 2 decades, stumbled into the dining room. He was severely out of breath, his face entirely drained of color. His pristine uniform was slightly askew, and his hands were trembling visibly as he gripped the doorframe to prevent himself from collapsing. Richard lowered his newspaper, his thick eyebrows knitting together in immediate irritation. "Thomas, what is the meaning of this? I told you to bring her down, not to run around the house like a madman." Thomas gasped for air, shaking his head frantically. He looked directly at my father, his voice trembling so badly he could barely force the words out. "Sir, she is gone. She is—" Richard slammed his heavy palms onto the dining table with such force that the silverware violently rattled against the fine porcelain plates. The absolute certainty he had projected just moments ago shattered instantly. He stared at the terrified butler, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "What do you mean she is gone?" Richard bellowed, his voice vibrating with unfiltered rage. "I personally turned the deadbolt on that door last night. I placed the only key inside my safe. Are you telling me a 33-year-old woman somehow evaporated through solid walls?" Thomas took a trembling step backward, his eyes wide with genuine panic. "I swear to you, sir, the door was locked exactly as you left it. I used the master key to open it just now. The bed is perfectly made. She is simply not there." Richard did not wait to hear another word. He shoved his chair back so violently it crashed onto the marble floor. He stormed past the trembling butler, his heavy footsteps thundering toward the grand staircase. Cameron immediately jumped up and followed his father, his previous arrogance momentarily replaced by sheer confusion. Beatrice trailed behind them both, clutching her silk morning robe, demanding to know what kind of ridiculous prank I was playing on the family. They sprinted up the sweeping curved staircase to the second floor. Richard reached the heavy oak door of my childhood bedroom and grabbed the brass handle. He twisted it, shoved the door inward, and the heavy wood slammed violently against the interior wall. Richard and Cameron rushed into the room, their eyes frantically sweeping the space. The room was immaculately clean. The pale pink canopy bed had not been slept in. The heavy duvet remained perfectly flat and undisturbed. The closet doors were wide open, revealing empty hangers. My weekender bag was gone. The only disruption to the pristine, sterile environment was the set of French doors leading out to the stone balcony. They were wide open. A crisp, biting morning breeze blew through the gap, catching the sheer white curtains and making them billow wildly into the room like ghosts. Richard marched over to the balcony and peered over the iron railing, looking down at the steep drop to the manicured lawn below. He cursed loudly, striking the iron railing with his fist. She climbed down the trellis. The ungrateful coward actually climbed down the side of the house in the middle of the night just to avoid facing her own brother. Cameron stood in the center of the room, a massive wave of relief washing over him. A smug, victorious smile returned to his face. He let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Let her run, Dad. This actually makes my job at the board meeting even easier. Fleeing the estate in the middle of the night is a clear admission of guilt. If she had stayed and fought, we would have had to deal with her crying and making up wild excuses. By running away, she just handed us the perfect narrative. The board will authorize a warrant for her arrest by noon." Cameron turned his attention away from the balcony, entirely convinced that his problem had permanently solved itself. He fully believed he had won the war without firing another shot. That was when his eyes landed on the center of the perfectly made bed. Resting exactly in the middle of the pink duvet was a single crisp sheet of white printer paper. Cameron chuckled, shaking his head. He walked casually toward the bed, completely devoid of any suspicion. "Look at this! She actually left a note. Probably some pathetic, rambling apology about how she could not handle the pressure of the corporate world. Let me read what the thief has to say for herself." He reached out and picked up the piece of paper. He brought it up to his eye level, fully expecting to read a tear-stained confession of weakness. Cameron's eyes scanned the top line of the document. The smug smile instantly vanished from his lips. The air in his lungs seized. His heart skipped a beat, then began hammering against his ribs with a violent, erratic rhythm. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty ash. This was not an apology letter. This was not a confession. Printed in flawless, high-resolution black ink at the top of the page was the official internal routing header for a highly secure proxy server located in the Cayman Islands. It was a server address that Cameron had personally paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to encrypt and hide behind layers of digital shell companies. It was an address that absolutely no one at Montgomery Holdings was supposed to know existed. His eyes darted frantically down the page, his hands beginning to shake so violently that the paper rattled in his grip. Below the routing header was a meticulous second-by-second transaction log. He saw his own heavily encrypted digital wallet IDs listed in plain text. He saw the exact timestamps of the $12 million transfer he had authorized 2 weeks ago. But the horror did not stop there. The document laid out his entire string of catastrophic financial failures with surgical precision. He saw the logs of his aggressive leveraged short positions on unregulated cryptocurrency exchanges. He saw the cascading series of margin calls. He saw the exact moments his frantic, desperate bets were liquidated by the trading algorithms. And then his eyes locked onto the bottom line of the page. Highlighted in bold, undeniable print was the final balance of the offshore account, $0. A cold, paralyzing sweat broke out across Cameron's forehead. His knees went weak, threatening to buckle beneath him. His mind raced desperately, trying to comprehend the sheer impossibility of what he was holding. He had installed a military-grade wipe script. He had rigged the firewall to destroy this exact data the moment anyone tried to access it. He had watched the confirmation logs himself. The realization hit him like a freight train. The firewall had not just been breached. It had been completely bypassed, analyzed, and cloned before his failsafe even had a chance to trigger. The woman who slept in this room, the sister he had mocked and underestimated his entire life, had effortlessly sliced through his defenses. She had not been pushing papers, she had been hunting him. She possessed the raw data. She possessed the proof. Cameron could not breathe. The walls of the room felt like they were shrinking, closing in around him to crush him alive. He opened his mouth, trying to pull oxygen into his burning lungs, but only a pathetic wheezing sound escaped his throat. "What is it?" Richard demanded, turning away from the balcony. He noticed the sudden, terrifying change in his son's demeanor. "Cameron, what does the note say?" "Read it to me." Cameron could not speak. He was entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his impending doom. The paper slipped from his trembling fingers, fluttering slowly through the air before landing softly on the carpet. Richard stomped across the room, his patience completely exhausted. He shoved Cameron aside, grabbed the paper from the floor, and held it up to the light. Richard was not a cybersecurity expert, but he was a veteran of the financial sector. He did not need to understand the complex cryptocurrency terminology to recognize a master ledger. His sharp eyes immediately caught the $12 million figure. He saw the offshore routing numbers. He saw the devastating zero balance. But most importantly, he saw the name attached as the sole authorizing entity for the account. It was not my name. It was Cameron's. Richard froze. The aggressive, domineering posture melted away, replaced by a sudden, chilling comprehension. He slowly lowered the paper, turning his gaze toward his golden boy. Cameron Richard whispered, his voice dangerously low, stripped of all its previous volume. "Why does this offshore ledger show $12 million vanishing under your personal digital signature? What is this zero balance?" Cameron backed away, his hands raised defensively. "Dad, I can explain. It is a fake. She fabricated this to frame me. You have to believe me, it is a complete forgery. Do not lie to me." Richard roared, stepping forward and grabbing Cameron by the collar of his expensive polo shirt. "This has your private offshore routing code. I know this code. You told me this account was for the commercial real estate acquisitions. Where is the $12 million, Cameron? Where is the investor capital?" Beatrice rushed into the room just in time to see her husband violently shaking their beloved son. "Richard, stop it! Are you out of your mind? Let go of him!" Before Richard could respond, before Cameron could formulate another desperate lie, the heavy silence of the morning estate was violently shattered. From the front of the mansion, down the long, winding private driveway, came the sudden, deafening sound of heavy vehicle tires screeching against the asphalt. Multiple engines roared in unison, burning rubber as they aggressively braked right in front of the main entrance doors. The violent screech of heavy tires against the asphalt outside snapped Richard out of his murderous trance. He abruptly released his grip on Cameron's collar. Cameron collapsed heavily against the edge of the vanity desk, clutching his throat and gasping frantically for air. The sudden chaotic noise from the driveway completely shattered the suffocating tension inside my empty bedroom. Beatrice demanded to know who was outside, her voice shrill with a new kind of panic. Richard did not answer her. He snatched the printed Cayman Islands ledger from the bed, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the paper and sprinted back out into the hallway. Cameron and Beatrice scrambled to follow him, their footsteps thundering down the sweeping marble staircase. As Richard reached the bottom step, the massive double doors of the Montgomery estate did not just open. They were violently shoved apart, the heavy wood crashing loudly against the interior walls of the grand foyer. Standing in the entryway was not the police, it was Harrison Gable. Harrison was the chief legal counsel for Montgomery Holdings. For over 20 years, he had been the impeccably groomed attack dog of our family, a ruthless corporate attorney who wore $5,000 bespoke suits and never allowed a single hair to fall out of place. He was a man who handled billion-dollar mergers with absolute icy composure. But the man standing in the foyer this morning looked like he had stared directly into the abyss. His expensive silk tie was yanked loose and hanging crookedly around his neck. His tailored jacket was severely wrinkled, and his dress shirt was soaked with dark patches of sweat. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as if he had sprinted all the way from the corporate headquarters downtown. He clutched a thick, bulging leather briefcase to his chest like a shield. Harrison ignored the trembling butler standing near the doorway. He completely ignored Beatrice, who was demanding to know why he was barging into their home unannounced. He marched straight past them, his eyes locked entirely on my father. He headed directly for the formal living room, his hard leather shoes clicking aggressively against the polished stone floor. Richard followed him closely, demanding answers, waving the printed offshore ledger in the air. Harrison reached the center of the living room and stopped at the massive glass coffee table. He unzipped his leather briefcase with shaking hands. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and hurled them onto the glass surface with explosive force. The heavy papers scattered, fanning out like a deck of catastrophic cards across the table. Staring back at the family, stamped across the top of every single page in bold, glaring red ink, were the official, unmistakable seals of the United States federal government. "What the hell have you done?" Richard Harrison screamed. The sheer volume and absolute panic in the sophisticated lawyer's voice made Richard physically recoil. "Do you have any idea what you have triggered this morning?" Richard held up the single sheet of paper he had taken from my bed, his face flushed with defensive anger. "Harrison, calm down and listen to me. It is Cameron. My idiot son lost the money. He forged the internal audit to cover his tracks. But we can contain this. We will say he acted alone as a rogue executive. You can draft a separation agreement and a non-disclosure contract right now. We will handle the board." Harrison let out a harsh, hysterical laugh that bordered on pure madness. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at the federal documents scattered across the table. "Contain this," Harrison yelled, the veins bulging in his neck. "Richard, you are completely blind. You cannot contain a nuclear explosion. I received a highly encrypted email at exactly 6:30 this morning. It contained a complete, unfiltered data dump of every single illegal transaction your golden boy has executed over the past 6 months. The cryptocurrency gambling, the offshore shell companies, the spoofing software he used to frame his own sister. It is all there in flawless, undeniable detail. But that is not even the worst part." Harrison grabbed Richard by the lapels of his expensive morning robe, a massive breach of protocol that showed exactly how far their world had fallen. "The email did not come from an angry daughter." Harrison continued, his voice echoing brutally in the cavernous room. "It came from a secure federal relay. She is not an employee, Richard. She is not some pathetic data clerk you hired out of pity. She is a highly classified financial forensics expert. She was intentionally planted inside our network by the Securities and Exchange Commission 6 months ago." The words hit the room with the force of physical blows. Beatrice gasped loudly, covering her mouth with both hands, as she stumbled backward into a sofa. Cameron, who had just staggered into the living room behind them, hit his knees on the plush carpet. The remaining color drained completely from Richard's face, as the true identity of the daughter he had mocked, belittled, and grounded finally registered in his brain. "She played you," Harrison spat, shoving Richard away in absolute disgust. "She let you humiliate her in front of 45 relatives. She let you lock her in that bedroom so she could have unimpeded, unmonitored access to the local servers without raising any suspicion. She bypassed every firewall we spent millions building. She cloned the ghost ledgers. She packaged the proof of Cameron's offshore gambling, and she sent it directly to the federal authorities before walking right out your front door." Beatrice stepped forward, her voice shaking with desperate, pathetic denial. "No, that is impossible. You are lying, Harrison. She is just a jealous, spiteful girl. She does not have the skills to do something like that. She is trying to ruin her brother because she hates him. You have to fix this. You are our lawyer. Call a federal judge. Get a gag order. Get an injunction right now." Harrison turned to my mother with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Beatrice, wake up from your delusion. There are no injunctions for this. She did not just file a simple complaint. She enacted a global financial quarantine. She triggered a Category 1 asset freeze across the entire corporate structure. As of 7 o'clock this morning, every single bank account associated with Montgomery Holdings has been completely locked by federal mandate." Richard stumbled backward, his legs suddenly giving out as he fell heavily into a leather armchair. "The corporate accounts," Richard rasped, his voice barely a whisper as his empire evaporated before his eyes. We can use the offshore reserves to pay for a defense team. We can use my private trust. Did you not hear a single word I just said? Richard Harrison yelled, slamming his open palm against the glass table. Global asset freeze. The corporate accounts. The offshore reserves, your personal checking accounts. Beatrice's trust funds, the offshore shells. Cameron set up to hide his gambling. All of it is frozen solid. The red stamps on those papers are federal seizure orders. Your credit cards will decline if you try to buy a cup of coffee right now. We have zero liquidity. You are completely, utterly penniless. Cameron let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper from his spot on the floor. He curled into a fetal position on the expensive rug, gripping his hair in his hands. He finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. The $12 million he had lost was just the initial spark. I had burned down the entire forest to catch him. The family empire, the vast legacy they had valued over my own existence, was permanently eradicated with a few lines of code. They had handed me the keys to their destruction, and I had turned the lock. Richard clutched his chest, his breathing shallow and rapid as the crushing weight of reality settled over him. He looked up at his fiercely loyal lawyer, his eyes wide with a desperation I had never seen before. "What do we do?" Richard begged, his voice cracking. "Harrison, please. Tell me what we do to survive this." Harrison slowly backed away from the glass table. He picked up his empty leather briefcase, holding it loosely by his side. He looked at the family he had fiercely protected and enabled for 2 decades, and he simply shook his head. "I am not your lawyer anymore," Richard Harrison said, his voice dropping to a cold, flat monotone. "I am resigning from Montgomery Holdings effective immediately. I highly suggest you find yourselves a very good public defender." Before Richard could even open his mouth to process the abandonment, a new sound pierced the heavy, suffocating silence of the mansion. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the far distance. Within seconds, it multiplied, growing louder, sharper, and far more aggressive. It was the unmistakable, terrifying shriek of multiple federal sirens echoing fiercely down the private street and heading straight for their front gates. Harrison Gable did not even look back as he turned on his heel and walked out the front door, slipping past the impending chaos and severing his ties with the doomed empire forever. Richard Montgomery did not watch his most trusted advisor leave. The primal, undeniable instinct of self-preservation violently overrode his initial shock. The wailing sirens were no longer a distant, abstract threat echoing from the city streets. They were a rapidly approaching reality, bouncing fiercely off the high stone walls of his own private estate. Richard Montgomery, a man who had spent 3 decades manipulating global markets, buying off politicians, and ruthlessly crushing his competitors, refused to accept that a single digital strike from his discarded daughter had permanently checkmated him. He operated on the fundamental belief that billionaires do not simply lose. He believed there was always a backdoor, a hidden lever to pull a secret parachute designed specifically for the elite. He sprinted out of the formal living room, leaving his wife and son entirely paralyzed on the expensive Persian carpet. He rushed down the long, opulent corridor toward his private, soundproofed study at the rear of the mansion. He threw open the heavy mahogany double doors and immediately headed for the priceless oil painting hanging directly behind his executive desk. He tore the artwork off the wall with zero regard for its value, letting the heavy gold frame crash loudly to the hardwood floor, exposing a flush biometric wall safe hidden in the drywall. He pressed his right thumb against the glowing green glass pane. "Access denied." A sharp red light flashed across the scanner. Richard cursed loudly, his chest heaving as panic finally began to claw at his throat. He wiped his sweaty thumb aggressively on the fabric of his morning robe and pressed it firmly against the glass pane a second time. Access granted. The heavy steel door clicked and popped open. He completely ignored the thick stacks of emergency currency and the velvet boxes of untraceable diamonds. He reached straight to the back of the safe and grabbed a heavy encrypted satellite phone. This specific device was entirely disconnected from the Montgomery Holdings corporate network and completely invisible to standard cellular towers. It was his direct, unmonitored lifeline to a senior wealth manager at an ultra-exclusive private banking institution located in Zurich, Switzerland. The account held $80 million of untethered personal wealth, a fortune deliberately hidden from the Internal Revenue Service for exactly this kind of apocalyptic scenario. He dialed the secure sequence with shaking fingers. The line connected after 3 rings. The voice of his private banker, a man whose tone was normally dripping with obsequious respect and eagerness to please, sounded alarmingly tense and uncharacteristically cold. Richard did not bother to exchange pleasantries. He immediately recited his alphanumeric authorization passcode and ordered an emergency full liquidation transfer of all assets into a series of untraceable shell accounts in Dubai. There was a terrible, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. The heavy silence stretched for several seconds. The Swiss banker cleared his throat. He coldly informed Richard that the authorization passcode had been permanently revoked. Richard screamed into the receiver, slamming his fist onto his desk. He demanded they override the system immediately. He reminded the banker of his elite status, his immense wealth, and the decades of highly profitable business they had conducted together. The banker cut him off sharply. The tone was entirely devoid of respect now. It was the tone a person uses when speaking to a convicted criminal. The banker explained that an international compliance freeze was enacted just 14 minutes ago by the United States Department of the Treasury, acting in direct coordination with the Securities and Exchange Commission and international financial authorities. The offshore accounts were not just temporarily frozen, they had been officially seized under federal anti-money laundering statutes. The banker tersely advised Richard to retain competent legal counsel, stated that the bank would comply fully with all federal subpoenas regarding his hidden assets, and abruptly ended the call. The flat, hollow dial tone rang in Richard's ear like a physical death knell. His $80 million safety net had evaporated into nothingness. Before Richard could even begin to process the devastating reality that his secret fortune was gone, his personal smartphone resting on the desk vibrated violently. Then it pinged again and again. A rapid, relentless succession of notification chimes filled the quiet study, creating a terrifying digital symphony. He dropped the useless satellite phone and grabbed his smartphone. The home screen was completely overflowing with urgent red alerts. Automated text messages from American Express flooded his inbox. His exclusive Centurion Black Card had been suspended. A notification from Chase Private Client popped up seconds later. His Platinum checking accounts were locked under a federal hold. Alerts from Visa, MasterCard, and his private brokerage firms poured in simultaneously. Every single line of credit, every checking account, every emergency overdraft facility bore the exact same automated message: account disabled due to federal compliance directives. Out in the hallway, more electronic chimes pierced the air. Beatrice rushed frantically into the study, her face streaked with mascara and tears. She was clutching her diamond-encrusted smartphone as if it were a live grenade about to detonate in her hands. Her notifications were mirroring his perfectly. The limitless credit cards she had used to fund decades of extravagant shopping sprees, luxury spa retreats, and high society luncheons were entirely worthless plastic. She began reading the text messages aloud, her voice reaching a hysterical, breathless pitch. The bank was explicitly telling her that her transactions were blocked due to suspected criminal activity. Cameron stumbled into the study right behind his mother. He was holding his phone with trembling, clammy hands, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror. His corporate expense accounts, his personal checking, even the hidden slush fund he used for his private club memberships were locked down. His screen flashed bright red with aggressive fraud alerts. The entire Montgomery family was standing in a room surrounded by priceless art and imported furniture, and between the 3 of them, they did not possess enough usable capital to purchase a single cup of coffee. Beatrice spun around frantically, her breathing shallow and erratic. She dropped her phone onto the desk and ran to the leather sofa, grabbing her sleek tablet. Pure, unadulterated survival instinct overrode her lifelong dependence on her husband. She opened a private aviation app, her manicured fingers flying desperately across the digital keyboard. She attempted to book a direct immediate charter flight to a non-extradition territory in South America. She did not care about packing bags. She just wanted to run. The screen prompted her for payment. She inputted the details of a secret debit card she kept hidden from everyone, even from Richard. The loading wheel spun rapidly on the screen. Beatrice held her breath, praying silently that the sweeping federal net had somehow missed this one tiny obscure account. The spinning wheel stopped abruptly. A large, glaring error message popped up on the bright screen. Transaction declined. Code 05. Do not honor. Federal block active. Beatrice let out a guttural, terrifying scream that tore through her throat. She threw the expensive tablet across the room with all her might. It shattered violently against the heavy oak bookshelf, raining broken glass onto the floor. "We are trapped!" she wailed, sinking to the carpet and pulling frantically at her perfectly styled hair. She could not buy a flight. She could not hire a car. She could not even order a taxi. She realized the horrific, inescapable truth. The untouchable, arrogant matriarch of the Montgomery family was entirely stranded, waiting to be hunted down and caged inside her own lavish home. Richard watched his wife collapse into a pathetic, sobbing mess on the floor. He looked down at his phone, still vibrating relentlessly with alerts of his vanishing empire. Then slowly his gaze shifted toward the doorway. Cameron was standing there, leaning heavily against the doorframe for support. The golden boy, the chosen heir, the magnificent son who was supposed to elevate the Montgomery legacy to unprecedented heights of glory. Cameron was weeping openly, his face contorted in a mask of pathetic, cowardly fear. He was muttering incoherently under his breath, begging his father to fix it, begging for someone to make the nightmare stop, shifting the blame to everyone but himself. The brutal reality of the situation crashed down on Richard with unforgiving clarity. The federal agents currently speeding up his driveway, their sirens screaming through the morning air, were not here because of a minor regulatory error. They were not here because of a corporate misunderstanding or a vindictive daughter telling lies. They were here because the sniveling, incompetent man standing in the doorway had literally gambled away $12 million on internet tokens and then tried to blame his brilliant, highly capable sister. Cameron actually lost the money. Every single devastating word in that offshore ledger was true. Cameron's catastrophic, breathtaking stupidity was the sole reason the family was being annihilated. Richard did not say a word. The air in the study turned completely toxic. He took slow, deliberate, heavy steps toward his son. Cameron looked up, his tear-filled eyes widening in sudden sharp alarm as he registered the sheer murderous intent radiating from his father. "Dad, please," Cameron whimpered, raising his shaking hands weakly in a pathetic attempt to protect himself. "It was a mistake. I can win it back." Richard lunged forward. He did not punch his son. He did not tackle him to the floor. He simply drew back his large, heavy hand and delivered a vicious, open-palmed slap directly across Cameron's face. The sickening, explosive crack of flesh against flesh echoed sharply above Beatrice's hysterical sobbing. The sheer, unrestrained force of the blow snapped Cameron's head violently to the side and sent him crashing hard into the heavy wooden doorframe before he slumped onto the floor, tasting the bitter copper of his own blood. Beatrice scrambled up from the carpet, her previous despair instantly mutating into vicious defensive rage. She threw herself between her husband and her bleeding son, shielding Cameron with her own body. She shrieked at Richard, demanding to know how he could strike his own flesh and blood. She wiped the blood from Cameron's chin with the sleeve of her silk robe, cooing to him, as if he were a toddler who had simply scraped his knee on the playground rather than a corporate fraudster who had just incinerated their entire existence. Richard stared at his wife with profound, unmasked revulsion. He saw, perhaps for the very first time, the grotesque depths of her delusion. She refused to hold Cameron accountable. Even as the federal sirens wailed right outside their windows, Beatrice frantically began to rewrite the narrative in her mind. She pointed a trembling finger at the ceiling, screaming that this was all my fault. She wailed that I was a psychotic, vengeful monster who had set an elaborate trap to destroy my own brother because I could not handle his brilliance. In her twisted reality, Cameron was the innocent victim of my federal connections. She insisted that I should have fixed his financial error, that I should have covered his tracks, and that allowing the government to intervene was an act of pure, unforgivable evil. Richard let out a hollow, bitter laugh. He looked down at the two of them huddled on the floor. He finally realized that his entire life, his entire legacy, had been built on a foundation of incompetent, spoiled parasites. The heavy, reinforced oak front doors of the Montgomery mansion did not open politely. They were struck with a specialized tactical battering ram. The deafening crash vibrated through the floorboards of the study, followed instantly by the sound of heavy tactical boots swarming the marble foyer. The shouting of federal agents commanding the remaining household staff to secure their positions echoed fiercely down the long, opulent corridors. Special Agent David Caldwell marched into the study. He did not wear a tactical vest or carry a drawn weapon. He wore a sharp, dark suit and held a thick, heavily sealed folder. He was flanked by 4 heavily armed federal agents who immediately secured the perimeter of the room, blocking any possible exit. Caldwell looked around the luxurious space, his eyes briefly sweeping over the shattered tablet, the scattered offshore ledgers, and the pathetic scene of the former billionaire and his weeping family. His expression was a masterclass in professional detachment. He had spent his entire career hunting men exactly like Richard Montgomery, men who believed their bank accounts placed them above the law. Caldwell stepped forward and slammed the thick folder onto the center of Richard's mahogany executive desk. He announced himself with cold precision. He declared that he possessed a federal search and seizure warrant authorized by the United States District Court, citing massive wire fraud, money laundering, and severe violations of the Securities Exchange Act. Richard tried to summon his commanding executive persona. He straightened his posture and demanded to call his attorneys, threatening Caldwell with high-profile lawsuits and career ruin. Caldwell simply smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. He informed Richard that Harrison Gable had already contacted the federal prosecutor's office to formally distance himself from the family, offering full cooperation and surrendering the company's internal communications in exchange for immunity. The last line of defense had completely defected to the winning side. Caldwell raised his hand and gave a sharp signal to his team. The dismantling of the Montgomery empire commenced immediately. A specialized cyber forensics team flooded into the study. They ignored Richard's loud protests as they physically unplugged the massive desktop computers, seized every smartphone on the desk, and began bagging the encrypted hard drives. In the formal living room, agents were already pulling priceless authenticated European oil paintings right off the silk-lined walls. They carefully wrapped the artwork in protective evidence material, treating the family's prized possessions as nothing more than seized criminal assets purchased with stolen investor capital. Through the large study windows, Richard could see the front driveway. A fleet of flatbed tow trucks had breached the main gates. Federal agents were actively descending into the climate-controlled underground garage. They were attaching heavy steel chains to the axles of Richard's customized imported supercars. The roar of the high-performance engines echoed across the manicured lawns as the luxury vehicles were forcefully driven up the ramps and secured onto the tow trucks. The tangible symbols of their extreme wealth were being stripped away piece by piece right in front of their eyes. Beatrice watched her entire universe being dismantled. She ran toward one of the agents attempting to seize a rare antique vase from the hallway pedestal. She clawed at the agent's tactical vest, screaming that these were her personal belongings, bought with her own family money. 2 female officers quickly intercepted her, firmly restraining her arms behind her back and warning her that any further physical interference would result in an immediate charge of assaulting a federal officer. Beatrice collapsed against the wall, her frantic screams devolving into a stream of incoherent, breathless sobs as she watched a federal agent catalog her diamond jewelry into clear plastic evidence bags. Caldwell turned his full attention back to the corner of the study. Cameron was still cowering on the floor, his knees pulled tightly to his chest. The facade of the polished, untouchable vice president had completely eroded. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting wildly around the room as the federal agents systematically gutted his unearned inheritance. "Stand up," Cameron Caldwell ordered, his voice echoing with absolute uncompromising authority. Cameron did not stand. He shrank further back against the wall, shaking his head frantically. The 36-year-old man who just hours ago had stood in a ballroom and confidently ruined my reputation in front of 45 people, completely shattered. He began to weep loudly, a wet, ugly, pathetic sound. He looked up at Beatrice, extending his trembling hands toward her. He cried out for his mother, begging her to make the agents leave, begging her to fix the mistake. He promised he would never gamble again. He promised he would be good. It was a grotesque display of ultimate cowardice. Beatrice tried to lunge forward to comfort her golden boy, but the officers held her firmly in place. She could only watch in absolute horror as David Caldwell signaled to two towering tactical agents. They stepped forward and hoisted Cameron off the floor by his armpits, dragging him to his feet like a limp, useless rag doll. Cameron kicked and thrashed weakly, his expensive polo shirt tearing at the collar. He pleaded with the agents, offering to tell them everything about his father's hidden accounts, if they would just let him go. He offered to testify against his own parents to save himself. His lifelong loyalty evaporated the exact second his personal freedom was threatened. He babbled about offshore trusts and hidden safety deposit boxes, desperate to trade his family for a lighter sentence. Caldwell stepped right in front of the sobbing, hyperventilating man. He reached to his belt, unclipped a pair of heavy stainless steel handcuffs, and grabbed Cameron's right wrist. The harsh metallic sound of the ratcheting teeth locking around Cameron's wrist cut through the chaos of the room with definitive finality. Caldwell grabbed the left wrist, pulling Cameron's arms forcefully behind his back, and secured the second cuff tight against his skin. "Cameron Montgomery." Caldwell stated, his voice ringing out clearly over the sound of Cameron's pathetic wailing. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, money laundering, and the embezzlement of $12 million from Montgomery Holdings. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." Special Agent David Caldwell's voice echoed brutally through the decimated study as he shoved the sobbing, hyperventilating vice president toward the hallway. Cameron stumbled over his own expensive shoes, his hands locked securely behind his back in heavy stainless steel cuffs. Richard stood completely frozen among the ruins of his executive sanctuary. The federal agents were systematically tearing his entire life apart, stuffing highly classified financial documents into plastic evidence bins, and ripping encrypted hard drives straight from the walls. Caldwell turned back to Richard and extended an open hand, demanding the CEO surrender his personal smartphone. Richard clutched the device tightly against his chest, his large hands shaking violently. He begged the federal agent for exactly 60 seconds. He pleaded for one final phone call to his daughter. Caldwell stared at the broken billionaire with utter indifference, then slowly lowered his hand and stepped back, granting the pathetic request. Richard frantically dialed the number, his thumb slipping erratically against the glass screen. High above the chaotic streets of the financial district, inside the serene, soundproof walls of the presidential suite at the Ritz-Carlton, my personal phone began to vibrate against the cool marble countertop. I was sitting at a sleek glass dining table positioned directly in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. The morning sun bathed the luxurious room in a warm, golden glow. Room service had just delivered a flawless 5-star breakfast. A polished silver cloche sat next to a pristine plate of truffle eggs, imported smoked salmon, and a steaming cup of premium dark roast coffee. I was wearing a thick, plush hotel robe, completely relaxed, watching the tiny vehicles navigate the city grid far below. This was the city my father thought he owned. Today, it felt like it belonged entirely to me. The phone vibrated a second time, then a third. I did not rush. I picked up my heavy silver fork, took a slow, deliberate bite of my breakfast, and savored the rich, complex flavors. I let the phone ring until the very last possible second before it diverted to voicemail. I pressed the green accept button, placed the device on speakerphone, and set it back down on the cool, marble counter. I did not offer a greeting. I simply let the dead, heavy silence stretch across the line, forcing him to speak first. Gemma. The voice that exploded from the small speaker was utterly unrecognizable. It was not the booming authoritarian roar that had commanded elite boardrooms for 3 decades. It was a high-pitched, breathless screech of pure, unfiltered panic. Gemma, please. You have to listen to me. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread pleasantly through my chest. I am listening, Richard. I stripped away his parental title deliberately. He did not deserve it anymore. They are taking him, Richard shrieked, the sound of heavy tactical boots and federal radio chatter echoing faintly in the background of his call. They put Cameron in handcuffs. They are dragging your brother out the front door right now. You have to stop this. I am begging you, Gemma. Please, I am begging you on my knees. I leaned back in my comfortable chair, staring out at the towering skyscrapers. The Securities and Exchange Commission does not take requests, Richard. They take evidence. I simply provided them with the uncorrupted data. What happens next is entirely out of my control. You can fix this! He sobbed, his voice cracking horribly. The mighty, untouchable billionaire was completely unraveling. You are the expert. You know these federal agents called David Caldwell. Tell him it is a massive misunderstanding. Tell him you ran the wrong diagnostic program. Tell him the financial data was misinterpreted. We can say the system was hacked by a foreign third party. Just tell them you made a mistake. He was still trying to negotiate. Even as his entire world burned to ash around him, he truly believed he could manipulate reality with a fabricated lie. He genuinely believed I would gladly throw myself under the bus, risk severe federal perjury charges, and destroy my own pristine career just to save the golden boy who had tried to frame me. There is no mistake, I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Cameron stole $12 million from your VIP investors. He lost every single cent on underground crypto betting exchanges. Then he accessed my terminal, forged my digital signature, and tried to send me to a federal penitentiary in his place. The data I handed over is absolute. It cannot be misinterpreted. We will pay the money back, Richard screamed desperately, his pride completely broken. I will liquidate the estates. I will sell the remaining corporate subsidiaries. I will give you anything you want. Gemma, do you want a seat on the board? You can have it. You want my majority shares. They are yours. Just make the federal agents leave. The family will be out on the streets. We will lose everything we have ever built. Please, you are destroying our family. I let out a soft, humorless laugh. The sound was sharp and icy in the quiet hotel suite. You destroyed this family a long time ago. I am just the one handing you the final receipt. Gemma. He wailed, his panic morphing into blind terror. Beatrice is having a nervous breakdown on the floor. The banks have frozen everything. We cannot even afford to hire a defense attorney. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. My flesh and blood? I asked carefully, setting down my coffee cup. My flesh and blood stood in a ballroom last night and allowed 45 relatives to laugh at me. My flesh and blood slapped me across the face for a crime I did not commit. My flesh and blood ordered me to be locked in a bedroom like a disobedient animal, stripped of my dignity, and commanded me to write a false confession so you could maintain your fraudulent empire. Richard gasped for air, his desperate mind searching for any possible lifeline. I was angry. I did not know the truth about the missing money. I thought I was doing what was best for the company. I am your father, Gemma. You have to save us. He was completely pathetic. The imposing giant who had terrorized and belittled me my entire life had shrunk into nothing more than a sniveling coward, begging for a bailout from the daughter he had violently thrown away. He expected blind loyalty from the very person he had tried to sacrifice. He expected unconditional devotion after decades of systemic emotional abuse. I stood up from the glass table and walked closer to the window, looking down at the tiny, insignificant vehicles crawling through the financial district below. I felt absolutely nothing for the man weeping on the other end of the line. No pity, no remorse. Only the pure, unadulterated satisfaction of absolute justice. Gemma, please say something, Richard cried out, his voice echoing with the final agonizing realization that his empire was permanently gone. "Tell me you will call the SEC. Tell me you will save your brother." I stared at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass. I looked calm, powerful, and completely untouched by the wreckage I had orchestrated. "I cannot do that," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly icy whisper that cut through his hysterics with surgical precision. "I am just a bad daughter who is grounded, Dad. Save your golden boy yourself." I reached down and pressed the red button on the screen. The line went instantly dead. I picked up the phone, powered it down entirely, and dropped it into the nearest trash can. I turned back to my lavish breakfast, feeling completely free for the very first time in 33 years. I finished the last bite of my breakfast and wiped my mouth with a linen napkin. I reached for the sleek remote resting on the marble table and powered on the massive flat-screen television mounted against the suite wall. I did not need to search for a specific channel. Every major financial news network was broadcasting the exact same breaking story. The chyrons scrolling across the bottom of the screen in bright, glaring red letters read, "SEC and FBI execute joint raid on Montgomery Holdings." The screen split into two live feeds. On the left, a news helicopter hovered over the corporate headquarters downtown, showing dozens of federal agents marching in and out of the glass lobby, carrying boxes of physical files and seized computer servers. On the right, a news crew had positioned themselves at the end of the private driveway of the Montgomery estate. I watched in high definition as two towering tactical agents dragged my brother Cameron out of the front double doors. He was still wearing the same expensive polo shirt from breakfast, but it was now torn at the collar and stained with blood from where my father had violently struck him. Cameron was weeping uncontrollably, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, his face buried against his chest to hide from the flashing cameras. He looked utterly pathetic, a spoiled child finally facing the severe consequences of the real world. While I watched the broadcast from the quiet sanctuary of my hotel suite, a very different kind of viewing party was happening across the city. The 45 relatives who had attended the anniversary gala the night before were waking up in their lavish homes. They were shaking off the effects of expensive champagne and top-tier caviar. They had gone to sleep feeling incredibly secure, fully believing that their golden boy Cameron was a financial genius and that I, the family disgrace, had been successfully neutralized. Their blissful ignorance shattered the moment they turned on their televisions or checked their morning news alerts. The sight of Cameron being shoved into the back of a federal vehicle was enough to induce widespread panic, but the real terror set in when the news anchors began detailing the scope of the investigation. The reporters explicitly outlined the Category 1 asset freeze enacted by the Treasury Department. They explained that Montgomery Holdings was completely locked down under federal anti-money laundering statutes, and that every single account tied to the firm, its executives, and its managed trusts was currently quarantined by the government. For the extended Montgomery family, this was not just a corporate scandal, it was a personal financial apocalypse. My father, Richard, had built his power within the family by demanding absolute financial control over every relative. He managed their retirement portfolios. He controlled the trust funds that paid for his nieces and nephews to attend Ivy League universities. He oversaw the investment accounts that allowed his siblings to maintain their luxury country club memberships and multiple vacation homes. Every single cent they possessed was funneled through Montgomery Holdings. They had gladly surrendered their financial independence in exchange for the massive guaranteed returns my father promised them. Now that entire interconnected web of wealth was frozen solid behind federal red tape. I walked over to my travel bag and pulled out a secondary, highly encrypted mobile device. It was a secure phone issued by the agency, entirely disconnected from the Montgomery network. 2 weeks ago, as part of my forensic investigation, I had silently cloned the family group messaging channel to monitor Cameron's internal communications. I opened the application and watched the digital meltdown unfold in real time. The family group chat, which just 12 hours ago had been filled with congratulatory messages for Richard and cruel mocking jokes about my forced confinement, was now a torrential stream of unadulterated panic. The messages were coming in so fast the screen blurred. Aunt Patricia sent the first frantic text. "What is happening on the news? Richard, tell me this is a joke. Tell me my charity foundation accounts are not frozen." Uncle Greg immediately followed. "I just tried to log into my private banking portal. Access denied." "Richard, answer your damn phone. I have a margin call on my commercial real estate loan due tomorrow. If that trust is locked, I am completely ruined." The denial quickly evaporated, replaced by visceral animalistic fear. Cousins who had sneered at me in the ballroom were now typing in all caps, demanding to know how they were supposed to pay their mortgages, their tuition, their car leases. The polite aristocratic facade they wore so proudly at family functions completely disintegrated. They resorted to raw profanity, cursing Richard and Cameron. Beatrice, ever the delusional matriarch, attempted to do damage control in the chat. She sent a voice note, her voice trembling and hysterical. "Everyone calm down. It is a misunderstanding. Gemma did this to us. She lied to the federal agents because she is jealous of Cameron. Richard is calling his lawyers right now to fix it. Just give us time." Her attempt to use me as the scapegoat failed spectacularly. The relatives did not care about the family drama anymore. They did not care about who was jealous or who was grounded. They only cared about their money. Uncle Greg fired back a vicious text. "Do not give me that garbage, Beatrice. The news says Cameron lost $12 million in offshore crypto gambling. You and Richard let that incompetent fool play casino with our life savings. I want my money released today, or I am calling the prosecutors myself and telling them everything I know about your hidden assets." The group chat devolved into an absolute bloodbath. They were tearing each other to pieces, threatening lawsuits, threatening to expose family secrets, and demanding immediate restitution. The fierce family loyalty my father had always bragged about was revealed to be nothing more than a fragile alliance built entirely on greed. The moment the money stopped flowing, they turned into starving wolves ready to devour their own pack leaders. I sat on the plush sofa watching the digital carnage scroll across the glowing screen. I did not type a single word. I did not need to defend myself. I just let them tear down the illusion of their perfect family. The messages escalated from panic to furious mobilization. Texts flew back and forth coordinating physical action. "Richard is turning off his phone. Beatrice is ignoring my calls. We need to go there right now before they try to flee the country. We cannot let them leave that house." They were no longer content to scream into their glowing screens. They needed to confront the architects of their ruin face to face. 30 minutes later, the news helicopters hovering over the Montgomery estate captured a bizarre and chaotic scene. The 45 relatives who had arrived the night before in chauffeured limousines, draped in diamonds and designer tuxedos, were now speeding up the private mountain road in a state of absolute frenzy. They drove their luxury sedans and sports cars, aggressively ignoring traffic laws and nearly colliding with one another in their desperate race to the top. They reached the towering wrought iron gates of the estate, only to find them securely locked by the federal agents, still conducting the search warrant inside. The relatives did not turn around and go home. They abandoned their expensive vehicles right there on the shoulder of the road, blocking the entire driveway. Aunt Patricia, Uncle Greg, and dozens of other cousins marched up to the heavy iron bars. The same people who had laughed so cruelly at my humiliation were now gripping the cold metal gates, shaking them violently and screaming at the top of their lungs, demanding that Richard Montgomery come outside and face them. They had officially laid siege to the mansion. I sat on the edge of the plush velvet sofa in my hotel suite, utterly captivated by the live helicopter footage broadcasting across my television screen. The high society elite of the Montgomery family people who normally spent their mornings complaining about the temperature of their oat milk lattes at the country club had completely descended into primal feral madness. Uncle Greg, a man who prided himself on his custom-tailored Italian suits and impeccable etiquette, was entirely unrecognizable. The news cameras zoomed in tightly as he bent down his face, a terrifying shade of purple, and grabbed a heavy, decorative landscaping brick from the edge of the immaculate driveway. With a guttural, furious scream that I could almost hear through the screen, he hurled the heavy stone straight over the towering iron gates. The brick sailed through the air and smashed violently into the windshield of Richard's remaining corporate sedan parked in the courtyard. The shattering glass exploded outward, a brilliant, sparkling manifestation of their broken trust. Aunt Patricia was right beside him. She was gripping the thick iron bars of the main gate and shaking them like a trapped, starving animal. Her expensive cashmere cardigan was tearing against the sharp metal, but she did not care. She was screaming obscenities at the top of her lungs, demanding that my father come outside and face the firing squad he had created. The federal agents, who had been entirely focused on meticulously bagging evidence inside the estate, were now forced to rush out to the front courtyard. They quickly formed a defensive tactical barricade behind the iron gates to prevent the mob of enraged billionaires from storming the property and physically tearing Richard and Beatrice limb from limb. The authorities had to use bullhorns, warning the crowd of relatives that attempting to breach a federally secured crime scene would result in immediate mass arrests. The news helicopter shifted its camera angle, panning up toward the second floor of the mansion. Through the large master bedroom window, I could clearly see the pale, terrified face of my mother Beatrice. She was peering through the heavy silk drapes, watching her own sister, Aunt Patricia, actively leading a violent riot against her home. Beatrice looked completely paralyzed by horror. The very people she had spent her entire life trying to impress, the high society circle she had sacrificed her own daughter to appease, were now actively baying for her blood. The illusion of her flawless aristocratic family had been brutally ripped away, exposing nothing but a pit of greedy, desperate vipers. As I watched the chaotic scene unfold on the television, a sharp, continuous buzzing sound pulled my attention away. My secondary business phone, the highly secure device tied directly to my independent forensic agency, was vibrating violently against the marble countertop. The financial news anchors on the broadcast had just released the full, unredacted details of the Securities and Exchange Commission operation. In their reporting, they explicitly named my independent firm as the primary consulting agency that had provided the crucial whistleblower data. The connection had been made public. My screen lit up with an absolute barrage of incoming messages. The 45 relatives, having realized that Richard and Cameron were locked down and completely useless, had frantically scoured the internet. They had tracked down my professional contact information, bypassing the personal number I had thrown in the trash, and were now flooding my business inbox with a tsunami of digital panic. I picked up the device, unlocked the screen, and began to read. The sheer magnitude of their hypocrisy was physically nauseating. The first message was from Aunt Patricia, sent just minutes after she had hurled herself against the iron gates on live television. "Gemma, darling, please, you have to listen to me. I just saw the news about your agency. You are a brilliant financial expert, sweetheart. You know I always said you were the smartest person in this family. Please, you have to access the federal system and save my retirement fund. I know what happened last night. Looked bad, but your father forced us to laugh. We were terrified of his temper. I always believed in you, Gemma. Please call me back immediately." I let out a cold, sharp laugh, forced to laugh, terrified of his temper. The blatant rewriting of history was staggering. Just 12 hours ago, Aunt Patricia had been standing in the center of the ballroom, clutching her pearls and loudly declaring me a stain on the Montgomery legacy. She had thoroughly enjoyed watching my mother slap me. She had cheered when my father publicly humiliated me. She was not a hostage to Richard's temper. She was an active, willing participant in his cruelty, fully compliant, as long as he kept her bank accounts overflowing with cash. The next message was a frantic, rambling voice note from Cousin Leo, the same man who had confidently sneered at me and called me a jealous, bitter spinster the night before. I tapped the play icon and listened to his pathetic, trembling voice fill the hotel suite. "Gemma, I am begging you. Please," Leo sobbed into the microphone, his voice cracking with genuine terror. "The bank just rejected my mortgage payment. They are going to foreclose on my house by the end of the month. You have the federal connections. You can trace where Cameron put the money. Just get my trust fund released. I am so sorry about last night. We all knew Cameron was lying, But nobody wanted to cross your dad. You are the only one who can fix this. You are our only hope. I deleted the voice note before he even finished speaking. The messages continued pouring in an endless stream of manufactured apologies, desperate flattery, and pathetic excuses. They praised my intelligence. They condemned Cameron. They swore absolute loyalty to me. They expected me to play the role of the dutiful, forgiving daughter who would magically swoop in and rescue them from the consequences of their own blind greed. They assumed that because I possessed the technical skills to untangle the financial web, I would naturally deploy my federal resources to save their lavish lifestyles. They actually believed that a few cheap text messages could instantly erase 33 years of systemic collective emotional abuse. I set the phone down and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city skyline. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for any of the 45 people currently rioting outside my former home. They had built their entire existences on a foundation of willful ignorance. They had gladly turned a blind eye to my father's tyrannical behavior and my brother's glaring incompetence because it funded their luxury cars and private club memberships. They had placed their unconditional faith in a golden boy who viewed their life savings as nothing more than a giant ATM for his reckless gambling addiction. They had made their bed and now the federal government was setting it on fire. I was not their savior. I was their reckoning. I walked back to the marble counter and picked up the vibrating device. I opened the administrative settings for my business communication portal. I was not going to waste my energy typing out 45 individual responses. I was not going to engage in their pathetic debates or read another highly fictionalized apology. I navigated to the automated response configuration and tapped the text box. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard, crafting a response that was legally airtight, perfectly professional, and emotionally devastating. I wanted them to read the exact words they had used against me, weaponized and reflected back at them with absolute finality. I typed the final sentence, reviewed the message for accuracy, and firmly pressed the Save and Activate button. Instantly, the automated system deployed the message. Every single relative who had frantically emailed, texted, or messaged my agency portal simultaneously received the exact same immediate reply. Thank you for contacting Montgomery Financial Forensics. For all inquiries regarding frozen assets, stolen trust funds, and financial compensation claims, please file a formal legal petition directly with the United States Federal Court. I have absolutely no authority to intervene on your behalf or negotiate the release of seized assets. Furthermore, I cannot accept any new clients at this time, as I am currently a permanent stain on the family legacy, and I am very busy being grounded. I watched the delivery confirmation receipts flood the screen. I knew exactly what would happen next. They would read the message. They would realize that the only person capable of navigating the complex federal bureaucracy to recover their money had just permanently locked the door in their faces. They would realize that their vicious laughter last night had cost them every single penny they owned. I turned the volume switch on the phone all the way down, silencing the frantic incoming alerts completely. I tossed the device onto the soft cushions of the hotel sofa and turned my attention back to the television screen, ready to enjoy the rest of the spectacular show. I watched the television broadcast closely, tracking the exact moment my digital strike landed. The high-definition camera mounted on the news helicopter zoomed in on Uncle Greg. He had just raised another heavy landscaping stone above his head, ready to hurl it at the remaining windows of the estate. Suddenly, he froze. He dropped the stone, scrambling to pull his vibrating smartphone from his tailored trousers. I could see the exact second my automated reply registered in his brain. His broad shoulders slumped forward, all the aggressive, riotous energy instantly drained from his body. He stumbled backwards, staring at the screen with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Aunt Patricia, standing right beside him, pulled out her own device. She read the message, let out a piercing shriek that the news microphones picked up clearly from a distance, and collapsed heavily onto the cold asphalt of the driveway. The domino effect rippled violently through the furious mob. 45 people simultaneously staring at their glowing screens, realizing that their only possible lifeline had just been permanently severed with a single, unapologetic paragraph. I walked back to the floor to ceiling windows, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of closure wash over me. Society always demands forgiveness. We are constantly conditioned to believe that family is a sacred, unbreakable bond, that shared blood requires endless second chances and unconditional grace. But forgiveness is a privilege earned through genuine remorse, not a mandatory right granted by genetics. These people did not love me. They never had. They only loved the convenience of having a designated punching bag to make themselves feel superior. They loved the comfort of their blind ignorance. To forgive them now would be a massive betrayal of the young, terrified girl who used to cry herself to sleep in that pale pink bedroom. It would invalidate decades of my own suffering. I realized in that moment that enablers are often far more dangerous than the actual abusers. Richard and Cameron were monsters, there was no denying that. But the 45 relatives who actively applauded the monsters, who eagerly supplied the audience for my public humiliation, they provided the crucial oxygen that allowed the abuse to thrive. They gladly traded my dignity, my sanity, and my self-worth for their quarterly dividend checks. Now those checks had bounced permanently, and they were desperate to pretend they had cared about me all along. They wanted me to absolve them of their guilt and restore their bank accounts. I refused to let them rewrite history. I refused to be their savior. By establishing that automated boundary, I was not acting out of petty vengeance. I was executing absolute, uncompromising justice. The broadcast shifted, capturing the crowd outside the gates, turning violently on itself. With no Gemma to save them and no Richard to bail them out, the aristocratic wolves began tearing at each other's throats. The polite veneer of high society completely dissolved into a pathetic public brawl right on the street. Cousins blamed uncles for convincing them to invest their life savings. Aunts screamed furiously at siblings for blindly trusting Cameron's non-existent genius. A physical altercation broke out between two distant relatives, their expensive suits tearing as they wrestled on the hood of an abandoned sports car. The federal agents standing defensive guard behind the iron gates did not intervene. They simply stood in rigid formation, watching the untouchable upper class crumble into dust. The news anchor's voice crackled with fresh, urgent excitement, drawing my attention back to the main courtyard of the mansion. Special Agent David Caldwell was walking out the front doors carrying the final plastic evidence bin filled with seized corporate hard drives. Behind him, two agents escorted a completely hollowed-out Richard Montgomery. He was not in handcuffs yet. The complex financial crimes required a mountain of federal paperwork before a formal indictment could be issued for the CEO, unlike Cameron, who had been caught red-handed with the fraud. But Richard looked far worse than arrested. He looked entirely broken. The commanding, terrifying patriarch had shrunk into a fragile, shaking old man. Beatrice trailed closely behind him, clutching her ruined silk robe tightly around her chest, her face a mask of absolute catatonic despair. But the federal government was not the only entity coming to collect its massive debts today. As Caldwell's team began loading their tactical vehicles, a convoy of sleek, unmarked black sedans pulled up right behind the federal trucks inside the courtyard. Several men in sharp, highly tailored business suits stepped out, carrying thick leather binders and official clipboards. They were not law enforcement. They were high-level representatives from the primary commercial bank that held the heavily leveraged mortgage on the Montgomery estate. I turned up the volume on the television, listening intently as the financial reporters explained the breaking development. The federal asset freeze executed by the SEC had instantly triggered a catastrophic default clause on the massive loans Richard had taken out against his personal properties. Because the firm's liquidity had hit absolute zero within seconds of my data dump, the bank was exercising its immediate non-negotiable right to reclaim the physical collateral. I watched in spectacular high definition as the lead bank representative handed Richard a thick stack of eviction documents. Richard did not shout. He did not threaten to call his lawyers. He just stared at the papers with vacant, dead eyes, his trembling hands too weak to even hold the folder. The bank officials marched straight up the grand stone steps to the towering oak front doors of the mansion. They unrolled a thick, highly visible band of bright yellow tape bearing the word "foreclosed" in bold black letters. They stretched the heavy tape tightly across the brass handles, physically sealing the doors shut. Another official slapped a large laminated legal notice directly onto the beautiful stone facade, officially declaring the property seized by the financial institution. The untouchable billion-dollar fortress of the Montgomery family was gone. Beatrice sank to her knees on the hard stone steps, sobbing uncontrollably as she stared at the bright yellow tape permanently barring her from her own home. They were officially locked out, stranded on the front steps, with nothing but the clothes on their backs, forced to turn around and face the furious rioting mob of relatives waiting just on the other side of the iron gates. 3 weeks later. The sterile fluorescent-lit conference room inside the United States Attorney's office in downtown Manhattan offered zero comfort. There were no imported leather armchairs, no crystal chandeliers, and absolutely no respect afforded to the Montgomery name. We sat around a massive, heavily scarred wooden table that smelled faintly of cheap industrial cleaner and stale coffee. The air conditioning hummed with a monotonous, oppressive drone. I sat calmly on one side of the table, flanked by Special Agent David Caldwell and my own independent legal counsel. I wore a sharply tailored navy blue suit, my posture relaxed, a stark contrast to the 3 individuals sitting directly across from me. Richard and Beatrice Montgomery were completely unrecognizable from the untouchable aristocrats who had hosted a 45-person gala just 21 days ago. Because my data dump had triggered a total federal freeze on all their assets, they had been entirely unable to hire a high-powered white-collar defense firm. Instead, they were flanked by 2 overworked, visibly exhausted public defenders who looked like they would rather be anywhere else on Earth. Richard wore a rumpled, off-the-rack gray suit that hung loosely on his dramatically thinned frame. He had aged 10 years in 3 weeks. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot and sunken from severe sleep deprivation. Beatrice looked even worse. The flawless blowouts and designer silk were gone. She wore a plain, muted cardigan, her graying roots highly visible, her hands shaking constantly as she stared at the blank surface of the table. They had spent the last 3 weeks bouncing between cheap motels, relentlessly hounded by the media and dodging aggressive lawsuits from furious relatives who had lost their life savings. The heavy steel door at the back of the conference room clicked open. The sound of heavy metal chains dragging across the linoleum floor echoed brutally in the quiet room. 2 towering United States Marshals escorted my brother into the room. Cameron Montgomery, the former vice president of Montgomery Holdings, the golden boy who was supposed to inherit the financial world, shuffled forward. He was stripped of his custom-tailored polo shirts and his arrogant smirk. He wore an oversized, bright orange county jail jumpsuit. His wrists were locked in heavy steel handcuffs attached to a thick belly chain, and his ankles were bound by iron shackles that restricted his movement to pathetic shuffling half-steps. He looked pale, sickly, and utterly defeated. The reality of federal lockup had broken him completely. He had been deprived of his luxury lifestyle, detoxing hard from his high-stakes crypto gambling addiction in a concrete cell. Beatrice let out a sharp, agonizing gasp when she saw him. She covered her mouth with her trembling hands, tears spilling instantly down her haggard cheeks. She tried to stand up to reach for her son, but one of the public defenders gently but firmly pulled her back down into her seat, warning her not to interfere with the federal marshals. Cameron did not even look at his mother. He did not look at my father. He kept his eyes glued to the scarred wooden table as the marshals forced him into a hard plastic chair directly across from David Caldwell. The lead federal prosecutor, a sharp-featured woman who possessed zero patience for corporate criminals, opened a thick file folder. She addressed Cameron and his assigned public defender, directly, completely ignoring Richard and Beatrice. She laid out the grim reality of his situation with clinical precision. She detailed the wire fraud, the massive money laundering, and the forgery of digital corporate signatures. She informed Cameron that he was looking at a mandatory minimum of 20 to 30 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The sheer weight of those numbers hung in the sterile air, suffocating the last remaining fragments of hope the Montgomery family possessed. Then she presented the lifeline. The prosecutor offered a formal plea agreement. If Cameron provided full, unredacted cooperation, if he walked the federal investigators through every single layer of the offshore shell companies, and if he provided sworn testimony against any co-conspirators, the prosecutor's office would recommend a reduced sentence of 15 years. I watched my brother closely. I expected him to hesitate. I expected him to look at his father, the man who had groomed him for power, and perhaps show a shred of familial loyalty. I expected him to at least struggle with the decision to turn state's evidence against his own blood. I wildly overestimated him. Cameron did not hesitate for a single second. Without even glancing at the public defender sitting next to him, Cameron leaned forward toward the microphone resting in the center of the table. His voice was shaking, high-pitched, and dripping with desperate, cowardly survival instinct. "I will sign it!" Cameron blurted out the words, tumbling over each other in his frantic rush to save himself. "I will tell you everything you want to know, but you have to understand, it was not my idea. I did not orchestrate the embezzlement. I am just a subordinate." Richard's head snapped up. His bloodshot eyes widened in sudden terrifying shock. Cameron finally turned his head and looked directly at his father. The fear in his eyes instantly morphed into vicious, self-serving betrayal. "My father made me do it," Cameron shouted, his voice echoing loudly in the conference room. "Richard Montgomery directed every single dirty transaction. He forced me to use the Cayman Islands proxy servers. He told me to gamble the $12 million to cover up existing corporate losses. And when the money was gone, he was the one who explicitly ordered me to forge Gemma's signature and frame her for the crime. I was just following the CEO's direct orders." A heavy, deathly silence descended upon the room. Beatrice sat entirely frozen, her jaw dropping open as she watched her beloved perfect golden boy hurl his own father directly into the federal wood chipper to shave 5 years off his prison sentence. Richard sat paralyzed for exactly 3 seconds. The civilized, aristocratic billionaire facade, a mask he had worn meticulously for 62 years, completely disintegrated. The sheer, unadulterated betrayal from his favorite son, the boy he had sacrificed me to protect, snapped the final fragile thread of his sanity. Richard let out a primal, deafening roar of absolute fury. He did not yell a warning. He did not hurl an insult. He physically launched his entire body across the heavy wooden conference table. The sudden explosion of violence caught everyone off guard. Richard scrambled violently over the scattered legal documents, knocking over plastic water cups and recording equipment. He lunged directly at Cameron, his large, shaking hands extending like feral claws. He grabbed his handcuffed son by the throat. Cameron choked, a horrible gagging sound escaping his lips as Richard's thumbs dug viciously into his windpipe. The heavy table groaned and shifted under their combined weight. Richard was screaming incoherently, his face a terrifying mask of purple rage, spitting curses at the son who had just handed him a federal prison sentence. Cameron, severely restricted by the steel handcuffs and the belly chain, could not defend himself. He thrashed wildly against the plastic chair, his face turning an alarming shade of red as his air supply was brutally cut off. Beatrice shrieked in absolute horror, watching her 2 brilliant men literally trying to murder each other in a government building. The high society family model was not just broken, it was being violently pulverized right in front of my eyes. The 2 United States Marshals reacted with trained, immediate aggression. They rushed forward, grabbing Richard by the shoulders and ripping him violently away from Cameron's throat. Richard fought them like a wild animal, kicking and thrashing, still trying to reach his son. The marshals slammed Richard face first against the concrete wall, securing his arms behind his back with brutal efficiency. Cameron collapsed forward onto the table, coughing and gasping frantically for air, his chest heaving as the public defenders backed away from the chaos in pure shock. I sat perfectly still in my chair. I did not flinch. I did not gasp. I simply watched the feral, pathetic display of a family destroying itself from the inside out. The absolute perfection of the moment was almost poetic. They had built their entire empire on a foundation of betrayal and greed, and now they were tearing each other's throats out over the ashes. The federal prosecutor ordered the marshals to remove Richard from the room immediately. As my father was dragged out into the hallway, still screaming profanities at his weeping, coughing son, Special Agent David Caldwell, slowly turned his attention away from the pathetic spectacle. Caldwell adjusted his suit jacket, his face a mask of cold professionalism. He looked across the table at Beatrice, who was now sobbing hysterically into her hands, and then he turned to look directly at me. The criminal execution was officially complete. The federal government had their confession, and they had their targets secured. Now it was time to address the collateral damage. Caldwell placed his hands flat on the wooden table and leaned toward me. "The federal criminal charges are secured," Gemma Caldwell stated, his voice cutting clearly through the lingering sounds of Beatrice's weeping. "However, there remains the matter of the locked local servers and the frozen external investor accounts." He paused, allowing the gravity of the shift to settle over the remaining people in the room. He was handing me the final ultimate weapon. "We need your proprietary decryption keys to legally refund the innocent third-party investors." Caldwell continued, gesturing toward my legal counsel. "You hold the leverage now. The floor is yours, Gemma. Please present your terms for the civil settlement." The room remained absolutely silent as David Caldwell's invitation hung in the cold, conditioned air. I did not rush to speak. I took my time, enjoying the profound shift in power. I reached down to the sleek leather briefcase resting beside my chair. The metallic snap of the latch's opening sounded like a gavel striking a block. I pulled out a perfectly organized stack of legal documents printed on thick premium paper and laid them flat on the scarred wooden table. My independent legal counsel handed me a silver pen. I rested my hands on top of the documents and looked directly across the table at my mother. Beatrice was trembling so violently that her plain cardigan shook against her narrow shoulders. She was staring at the papers as if they were a loaded weapon aimed directly at her chest. "I will provide the federal government with the master decryption keys," I stated, my voice echoing with crisp, unwavering authority. "I will personally assist your cyber division in untangling the mirrored servers and unlocking the frozen capital. But my cooperation comes with highly specific, non-negotiable conditions regarding exactly who gets their money back." The public defenders sitting across from me leaned forward, desperate for any shred of a lifeline they could throw to their clients. I turned my attention to Special Agent Caldwell. "The capital I help you recover will be strictly allocated to the innocent, external third-party investors. I am talking about the independent pension funds, the institutional partners, and the outside shareholders who had zero knowledge of Richard and Cameron's criminal enterprise. They will be made whole." I paused, letting my gaze drift back to Beatrice. Her eyes widened in sudden, terrifying comprehension. However, I continued, my tone dropping to a layer of absolute frost. "The 45 family members who hold private trusts within Montgomery Holdings are entirely excluded from my assistance. My decryption keys will not be used to expedite their refunds. The uncles, the aunts, and the cousins who gladly funded their luxury lifestyles with blind ignorance will be forced to stand at the very back of the standard federal bankruptcy line. They can fight the IRS for whatever pennies are left over at the bottom of the barrel a decade from now. I will not save them." Beatrice let out a sharp, strangled gasp. "You cannot do that to our family," she wheezed, her voice cracking under the sheer terror of facing the mob of relatives she had once proudly led. "They will destroy us. They will hunt us down. They have nothing left." "They have exactly what they deserve," I replied coldly. "They stood in a ballroom and applauded while you slapped me across the face. They cheered when my father locked me in a room. They gladly offered me up as a sacrificial lamb to protect their dividend checks. Now they get to starve together." Beatrice began to sob, burying her face in her trembling hands. But I was not finished. The true cost of my cooperation had not yet been presented. I slid a single highly detailed legal contract across the table. It stopped right in front of my mother. "There is one final condition for my cooperation," I announced, "and this one directly involves you and Richard." Beatrice slowly lowered her hands. She stared at the document, her bloodshot eyes scanning the bold legal headers. She looked confused, entirely unable to comprehend what more I could possibly take from her. The federal government had already seized the mansion, the offshore accounts, the luxury cars, and the art collection. She believed she was already at absolute zero. She underestimated my forensic capabilities. During my investigation into Cameron's offshore gambling, I told the room I mapped every single financial artery connected to the Montgomery empire. That included tracing the personal asset shielding strategies Richard employed over the last 10 years. I found the hidden limited liability company registered under a misspelled variation of your maiden name, Beatrice. Beatrice went completely rigid. The air seemed to instantly vanish from her lungs. I know about the modest three-bedroom house in the distant suburbs of New Jersey, I stated precisely. I know Richard bought it in cash 8 years ago as a designated safe house, a final secret fallback asset completely disconnected from the corporate portfolio. Because it was buried under a dummy corporation and never listed on your personal tax returns, the initial federal asset sweep missed it entirely. It is the only piece of real estate you still legally own. It is the only roof you have left to sleep under tonight. Beatrice began to shake her head frantically, her eyes darting between me, the public defenders, and the federal agents. No. No, you cannot know about that. We kept that hidden. We have nothing else. We are staying in cheap motels. We were going to move there tomorrow. You are not moving anywhere, I said, tapping the silver pen against the contract. This document is a binding deed of transfer. In exchange for my master decryption keys, you and Richard will sign over the absolute ownership of that suburban house to the Federal Victim Compensation Fund. The property will be liquidated at auction, and the proceeds will be used to help repay the external investors your son defrauded. The public defenders instantly began to protest, claiming I could not extort their clients for their last remaining residential asset. David Caldwell quickly silenced them with a sharp raise of his hand, reminding them that my cooperation was entirely voluntary and that Richard was currently sitting in a holding cell facing decades in federal prison. They had zero leverage to negotiate. Beatrice stared at the transfer deed. The absolute terrifying reality of severe poverty crashed down upon her head. Signing that paper meant literal, inescapable homelessness. It meant relying on homeless shelters or government assistance. The aristocratic matriarch who had spent her entire life dripping in diamonds and judging the working class was now staring directly into the abyss of complete destitution. She broke. The polished, arrogant facade she had worn for 60 years shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Beatrice Montgomery physically pushed her chair back, her legs giving out completely as she dropped heavily to the dirty linoleum floor of the federal conference room. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, completely ignoring the shocked stares of the federal agents and the public defenders. Her graying hair fell wildly around her tear-soaked face. She reached the edge of the table directly in front of me and desperately grabbed the fabric of my tailored navy suit. "Gemma, I am begging you!" Beatrice wailed, her voice a raw, agonizing shriek of pure desperation. She looked up at me from the floor, her face contorted in a mask of absolute terror. "Please, I am your mother. You cannot do this to us. We are old. We have absolutely nothing left. Your father is sick. We cannot survive on the streets. I will do anything you want. I will publicly apologize to you. I will tell the entire world how brilliant you are. Just let us keep the small house. Please do not leave your own parents out in the cold to die." I looked down at the pathetic, weeping woman clinging to my clothes. I felt the fabric of my suit pulling under her desperate grip. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I did not feel a trace of guilt. I looked at her hands, the same hands that had viciously slapped me in front of 45 laughing relatives just 21 days ago. I reached down and firmly detached her trembling fingers from my suit. I smoothed out the fabric with calm, deliberate precision. I leaned forward, looking directly into her wide, terrified eyes. "You want to talk about being left out in the cold?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, yet sharp enough to cut through the humming air conditioning. "You watched your husband lock me in a room to take the fall for a federal crime. You actively participated in a scheme to send me to a maximum security prison so your golden boy could keep gambling. You never acted like a mother. You acted like a warden managing a scapegoat." Beatrice sobbed violently, clutching her arms around her own chest as she rocked back and forth on the hard floor. "Gemma, please. We are family. You have to protect us." I picked up the silver pen from the table and held it out toward her, pointing the tip directly at the signature line on the transfer deed. You slammed the door of protection on me 33 years ago. Today I am simply taking back the key. Sign the paper. Beatrice stared at the silver pen as if it were coated in lethal poison. She looked up at the public defenders, her eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea for a miracle rescue, but they simply averted their gaze. They had no legal maneuvers left to offer. With a hand trembling so violently she could barely grip the metal barrel, she took the pen. The sharp scratching sound of ink transferring to the thick legal paper echoed loudly in the sterile conference room, finalizing the absolute surrender of their very last tangible asset. When Richard was briefly escorted back into the room to provide his mandatory signature, he did not put up a fight. The aggressive, tyrannical energy had been beaten completely out of him by the sheer crushing weight of federal indictments. He signed his name with a hollow, defeated stroke, sealing his own ruin. I collected the documents, verified the signatures, and handed the master decryption keys directly over to Special Agent David Caldwell. The exchange was strictly business, devoid of any emotional farewells. 6 months later, the federal court system handed down the final judgments, bringing the Montgomery Empire to its ultimate devastating conclusion. The justice system moved with brutal, unforgiving efficiency. Cameron Montgomery stood before a federal judge completely stripped of his arrogant swagger and his expensive corporate wardrobe. The judge accepted the prosecution's plea agreement, but offered absolutely no leniency or sympathetic remarks from the bench. Cameron was formally sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There would be no early parole, no country club prison facilities, and no special treatment for a white-collar criminal of his magnitude. The golden boy, who once believed he was destined to rule Wall Street and manipulate global markets, was permanently traded for a cramped concrete cell, a steel toilet, and a highly structured daily routine dictated entirely by armed prison guards. His status as the beloved heir meant absolutely nothing behind barbed wire. Richard faced a different, yet equally agonizing kind of life sentence. He managed to avoid a lengthy prison term by liquidating absolutely everything he owned and cooperating fully with the federal asset recovery teams. But his existence was permanently shattered. The Securities and Exchange Commission formally banned him for life from operating in any capacity within the financial sector. The bankruptcy courts aggressively seized his remaining personal accounts to satisfy the mounting mountain of legal fees and federal fines. To avoid sleeping in a municipal homeless shelter, the former billionaire was forced to seek manual labor. He eventually secured a minimum wage job as an overnight janitor at a discount supermarket located in a rough industrial neighborhood. The man who used to terrorize elite boardrooms, who fired executives on a whim and controlled billions of dollars, now spent his nights pushing a dirty yellow mop across stained linoleum aisles, cleaning up spilled soda and shattered glass jars under harsh fluorescent lights. Beatrice, entirely unable to cope with the severe, humiliating drop in social class, lived with him in a cramped, poorly insulated one-bedroom apartment. They spent their miserable days bitterly blaming each other for their total ruin, trapped in a toxic marriage with no money left to distract them from their mutual hatred. And then there were the 45 relatives, the aunts, uncles, and cousins who had eagerly participated in my public humiliation, discovered the true catastrophic cost of their blind loyalty. Because my decryption keys were exclusively utilized to refund the external innocent investors, the family trusts were left at the absolute bottom of the federal bankruptcy pile. By the time the government finished processing the massive liquidations and paying off the staggering corporate debts, the relatives lost exactly 70% of their entire retirement portfolios. The generational wealth they had so arrogantly flaunted evaporated overnight. I heard through the financial grapevine that Uncle Greg was forced to sell his cherished vacation homes and declare personal bankruptcy to avoid his creditors. Aunt Patricia had to pull her grandchildren out of their elite private academies and cancel her exclusive country club memberships, facing severe social ostracization from her former high society friends. They bombarded my business email with desperate pleas begging for insider favors or financial handouts, but my automated response remained firmly in place. They were forcefully dragged down from their pedestals and made to learn exactly how the other half lived. On the day the final federal injunction was officially closed, I walked out of the towering glass doors of the United States District Court. The heavy, oppressive air of the courtroom vanished instantly, replaced by the crisp, bright sunlight of a perfect autumn afternoon. The warm breeze caught the edge of my tailored navy blue suit jacket. I stood at the top of the wide concrete steps, taking a deep breath of genuine, unburdened freedom. I was 33 years old at the absolute peak of my career and completely untethered from the toxic anchors of my past. A massive crowd of financial journalists and news crews was waiting at the bottom of the courthouse steps. They surged forward the second they saw me, shoving microphones and flashing cameras in my direction. They aggressively shouted questions, demanding a statement from the woman who had single-handedly dismantled a corrupt financial empire and sent her own powerful family to ruin. They wanted a sensational soundbite. They wanted a display of anger, a dramatic tear, or a moment of gloating to play on the evening broadcast. I gave them absolutely nothing. I maintained my perfectly calm professional composure. I adjusted my dark sunglasses, looked straight ahead, and walked silently down the steps. The aggressive crowd of reporters parted like the Red Sea, intimidated by the cold, unbreakable boundary I projected. A sleek black executive vehicle was idling at the curb. Special Agent David Caldwell stood by the open rear door. He gave me a brief, deeply respectful nod, acknowledging not just my cooperation, but my unparalleled technical expertise. I was no longer a civilian asset acting on behalf of the government. My independent financial forensics firm was now the most sought-after investigative partner for federal agencies across the entire country. I stepped into the quiet, luxurious interior of the vehicle, sitting beside my top senior analysts who were already preparing the detailed briefs for our next major corporate takedown. The heavy door closed, securely shutting out the frantic noise of the press and the remaining ghosts of the Montgomery legacy. The car pulled smoothly into the bustling city traffic, carrying me toward a future I had built entirely with my own hands. I leaned back against the comfortable leather seat and watched the towering city skyline roll past the tinted windows. Family is not about the people who use blood ties to demand blind loyalty and endless sacrifices. Family is about the people who stand by you when the whole world turns its back. It is about mutual respect, shared integrity, and protecting one another from the darkness, not locking each other inside it. And sometimes, the most expensive, devastating lesson you can possibly teach toxic people is not delivered through screaming matches or bitter arguments. The ultimate lesson is simply walking away and showing them the absolute unbreakable power of your silence.